we're the magazine that is notoriously great at Twitch. So yeah.
No, I think it generates like a new, like each device that you sign into on it, once it's validated, it's on like its own session token.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Hopefully the chat
I don't know
works.
what the right term for that is.
Oh yeah, hopefully the chat works. Yeah, that first time.
Can someone log in on their personal one and maybe test it?
I
can do that.
Getting that.
Ooh, we got 5 people.
Oh, nice.
Ooh.
Hi, everybody.
Whoa.
You're still waiting for folks to get here, so it'll be probably around 10 minutes, 7 minutes before we start.
Formally shooting the shit.
Yeah. Okay. All right, I got the image saved, so now I'm gonna tweet that out. See, you're getting the behind the scenes action. This is how the magic happens.
It's just John Michael frenetically typing things into his phone.
Yeah, right. And fiddling with Google.
You thought it was like an office with like desks and chairs and people like doing things in like business casual. No, it's just John Michael sitting around in his room on his phone.
That's old school. That's fucking that's 70s shit. No, this is the future. The future is just wherever you happen to play video games. Also,
just imagining like, I don't know, like just waking up in the morning, rolling over onto bed, picking the phone up, just like tweeting something out and then just like throwing it down and be like, hard day's work done. Like just not even, that's the limits of it.
Well,
yeah.
Speaking of the future, Kyle is coming to us from 2041 after the second robot uprising.
Yeah, when we all had to go underground.
But before no, I'm gonna stop trying to say that sentence. I can't make that word. Forget I said anything.
Yes. We'll probably have to explain this a few times, but one of my roommates got a positive COVID diagnosis on Thursday. So I am at a high level of wariness. So far, I'm good, but
we discussed the notion of stuffing a lavalier mic inside the mask, but we have time to execute on that plan.
There was too much breathiness,
I could also, we also discussed maybe getting a throat mic.
Just occurred to me, if you didn't know what a throat mic actually was, that would sound like one of the strangest things. Like, I feel like if you just heard that idea and someone's like a throat mic, it'd be like, what? So you're just like,
wait, I am
sticking a tube down your throat? Like,
I actually don't know what
is a throat mic is. Yeah.
Oh, they're like chokers, and like they have this little like thing that basically goes like right where your larynx is, and then it picks up the vibrations directly from your throat, and then it puts that through a microphone.
That's so weird but cool. And
they got developed for like combat pilots actually back before the Second World War, and they're really good for high noise environments if you need to get like audio, like somebody's voice through some kind of high noise situation and record it or transmit it.
I don't know if any of you know the Vox podcast called Unexplainable. Actually, a friend of mine works on it, Bird Pinkerton. They do these incredible episodes on like explaining scientific phenomena or explaining the limits of science in answering certain questions. But they've had this incredible series recently on the senses, and they did an episode on hearing and explored examples of people who had hearing damage and who had like cochlear implants and who have to like gradually over time retrain their brains to process the kinds of inputs you get through cochlear implants, like because it's like it's really wild kinds of the amount our brains do to filter out and make sense of our sensory data is just completely bananas.
Yeah, and that's
I know with vision it gets wild. Like it's like it's like the reason why like if you ever like try to take a photo of the moon on your camera, it always comes out as like this weird like bright dot and it's like really small and you're like, what the hell is going on? And it's because your brain is basically doing like straight up like Photoshop on what your eyes are seeing and is enlarging the size of certain things to like, I don't know, just like experientially. So it's kind of like, or like you ever like see a city skyline in the distance, it looks much larger than it actually is. And so when you put a real camera in front of it, it suddenly looks like tiny and like distorted and stuff. But it's because our brains are constantly altering all of our sensory experiences.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this is like the what you might call like the cognitive science underpinning of the, I mean, maybe underpinning makes it seem too central, but it's like the upshot of like the stuff that we talk about in the new ontology essay, where like, you know, you always have this like model of the world. Like that's not just like a cool epistemological thing about like how you develop ideas. It's literally like, it seems anyway, according to a lot of like recent science, like the stuff that you were just talking about, that it seems like that's actually how we create our notion of like, I'm here in this room, you know, this is this object, this is that object.
It goes way further than that in some instances. Like there was one of my college professors, his PhD advisor or whatever you call that. I don't know what you call that. I didn't go down the academic track, but one of his professors was a guy who had done work on how language impacts perception, and had been one of the original people. I don't know if you've run into this, but there was like a very famous video that went around like a few years back around like how the colors, the main colors in a language all follow like this similar pattern, and it like if like a language has like 8 colors defined, like it's always the exact same 8 colors. Or if they have like 3 colors defined, it's always the exact same 3 colors. So he's one of the guys who like originally worked on that research, and like there's been a lot of stuff kind of going into how, especially with memory, your sense of like what things were like in your memory is heavily dictated by like the language you speak and the culture you're immersed in, and like the things, like the concepts that you have available to you. Like it's very heavily influenced, and your direct perception, like sensory experience, is also like not as to extreme a degree as memory, because memory is ultra fickle, but even like things you're actually experiencing in the moment can be pretty drastically altered by certain cultural things. Not to the point of like hallucinatory or anything like that, but it can modify. You know, it kind of falls into the space of like the, if anyone remembers the blue and black versus yellow or gold and white dress thing from like 6 or 7 years ago. It's kind of like, you know, where you get to those, where you get to those boundaries between like different ways of potentially having a brain interpret information, and now you have like a language influencing it, that can have a pretty drastic effect. And I don't know if I ever saw research done on it, but I'm willing to bet that if you took that dress thing that happened and you were to study people's perception or experience of it cross-culturally, you would see very clear divides based upon the language that people spoke, how many of them saw it as one way or the other.
It was so funny how there was like this identity politics that emerged about the dress meme. God, we're really dating ourselves too as millennials. I feel like any Zoomer watching will be like, what the hell are they talking about? But anyway, we're like,
as if we have Zoomers watching us.
the ones who saw it as yellow were like one faction, and then the ones who saw it as blue were like another faction. They were like started like fighting on like Facebook.
Oh yeah.
That was yeah.
Oh, one of the wildest versions of that. Not even like factionalism. I guess it was like wild shifts in identity and stuff. Was like, I'm trying to remember the game. It was, I don't know if it was called Rust or something like that, but it was this game where it was like the character creator was just one of these like ridiculously over-engineered things, and like you could change like any potential detail about the character. And then I think at some point they changed it so that it was like automatically generated, and then they eventually got to the point of adding in genitalia into the game when character models were nude, and people had absolutely no control over that. And there was like several people had like existential crises over what the game did to their characters. It was a very interesting. I don't know, it's interesting. It's kind of like games do that, where they'll model like wild sociological behaviors, you know, the infamous blood plague and World of Warcraft and that kind of thing.
That's why games are such an interesting art form, because there is this way in which they can model systems that in a way that like other forms of art can't. I mean, that was what you and what Kyle and I was pointing, but people can't see who I'm pointing to. what Kyle and Steve, when you went on the Evans podcast the other day, maybe this would be a nice transition into our theme here. when you guys went on the Evans podcast the other day and talked about the Forex upcoming Forex essay, but the way that you guys did it was as a game, right? It was like basically like, what if the People's Republic of Vancouver declared itself to be independent? And why did you guys pick that format for it?
Oh, well, that was like partly arranged with the host. We thought it'd be a fun way to just go like, what would you literally need to do in order to have like an honest assessment of what your capabilities are? What resources would a People's Republic of Vancouver have to play with, so to speak? And what would they need to do to develop further and develop like a following, you know, defend themselves from counter-revolution and stuff like that.
You're right, and there's something very valuable about putting yourself into an actual perspective,
Right.
as opposed to trying to put yourself into a hypothetical God's eye view, which is where you really tend to do theory crafting. And I mean, that's all fine and good. It's just, you know, it's good to also test that occasionally, not just with actual experiments, but even with just a thought experiment where you place yourself, you know, all of us who actually live in the world, we have a position. We are located somewhere in space. We have a history. We have an identity. And this is true of any entity that actually does anything in reality. And so making the decision to arbitrarily pick just a point and actually play through, like, okay, so what would I do with this kind of control? What would I do with this kind of power? Is genuinely helpful, because then you do actually take the time to consider, like, well, but I don't have this other thing. Like in theory, I might have access to every resource on the planet, but that's not actually ever going to happen. And by choosing, oh yeah, we're going to have access to logging and fishing, and that's really kind of going to be like central pillars of our economy, with terrible farming or whatever, that's valuable.
Yeah, it's like, what do you have right now? What do you need right now? Where, and then what is your goal as far as what you would like to have in the future versus what you would be okay still needing in the future? And then you move through continuous time towards that. You aren't just starting at like an abstract point where you haven't done like a sober analysis of what your capabilities are or anything like that.
That's a really good, using games to model that kind of thing is in general just a very good idea. Well, games can be used loosely in this context, but like militaries have been doing that for like 150 some odd years now. And it was like it was the Germans originally cooked that idea up, and like because of what they learned out of kind of screwing around like with like quite literally games, like put the Prussians in a position of like military dominance in Europe for an extremely long time. And that kind of thing also plays into a lot of other spaces. And when you like actually try to simulate these kinds of things, you get very interesting and important lessons that you might not if you're just kind of sitting there with, you know, as I think Carl mentioned, like some kind of God's eye view of the entire situation with like, ah, yes, I have perfect knowledge of everything happening. I have, you know, 100% access to whatever, and I can choose to ignore anything I like. Therefore, everything I decide is going to be correct and perfect. And, you know, the reality is you run face first into, if, you know, you have things like rules and like referees and considerations. You're going to run face first into all of your assumptions and bad ideas. You're going to face plant right into it, which is good because you want to do that in simulation rather than the real world.
And we, as far as the individuals that we hypothesized would be doing this work on the ground in Vancouver, it would be some sort of like an autonomous democratic institution who is operating with, you know, fog of war, essentially, and they don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of risk, but they do have some assets that they can play around with, including what was the focus of the exercise, foreign currency reserves, in order to, which in our view should be included as, it should be viewed as a biophysical resource, just like the lumber or the engineering capabilities of Vancouver Island would be. So it's something you need to economize on its use and then like maximize its usefulness for using it to import things that whatever money you create domestically won't really be worth much, at least initially. So you need to have a positive balance of payments, or have some way of bringing in the forex, and then using it judiciously, using it to grow your capabilities over time.
It's when it's not your currency, it's, you know, it counts as a scarce resource, and it's the one situation where money becomes a scarce resource is when it's another country's currency.
You can make infinity of your own money. That's the insight of Chartalism and MMT. And you need to, other people can make infinity of their monies, but you can't do that for them. So you have to go and get it somehow. And that's part of the development strategy that leftists should be considering in this fun exercise we did.
So that's you can listen to that episode in the It Can Happen Here podcast, which you can find anywhere you can find podcasts. It's one of the most recent episodes. I think it's called Money and the Survival of the Revolution. And yeah, there you have it. That's a good example of our magazine's kind of attitude towards things. Video games, economics, geopolitics, and cognitive science and epistemology are all connected. And you got to talk about them together sometimes if you want to have a cool, interesting conversation from a new angle. But today, how's that for a transition, huh? What we're going to be talking about is specifically economics, and and particularly along the theme that we've established for kind of this whole month of content that's coming out for the magazine, which is bottom-up economics. We have a number of articles that are going to be coming out soon, and we wanted to take the opportunity to kind of like have a little roundtable with all the editors, talking through some of the themes of the different articles that are coming up, and why they're important and why we think people should care, using the kind of like overarching umbrella theme of bottom-up economics, and also opening it up the floor to questions from any of y'all. So I think this is kind of the first event that we've had, I think, that has all of us, because I think that we've kind of all been juggling commitments. So it's always been like some cluster of us. Do we want to go around and just like briefly introduce ourselves? Like, it doesn't have to be like a big dramatic thing, but just like, you know, names, pronouns. I don't know, what's a good icebreaker question? What
Google icebreakers?
Yeah, this is my DSA. This is my DSA.
Or we could just not have an icebreaker and say whatever we want.
Yeah, whatever you want about yourself for people to know.
Okay, Steve.
Oh, sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Steve. Pronouns he, him. Let's see. I'm a co-editor of Strange Matters. And I'm mostly, I got my degree in economics. Most of my writing is, so far anyway, has been in the economics world, but I'm interested in pretty much everything. And I'm really into workers' cooperatives, which we are one. We're 100% worker owned and controlled, so that's great. Yeah.
I'll take it from there. I'm Frances. Pronouns are she, her. And like Steve, I studied architecture, and I've been involved in design and sustainability research for several years. And I mostly write about design and architecture. But I'm also interested in many other things. And that's why I work on this magazine.
And you're a brilliant designer.
Interest. Yeah, I also work on the design for the magazine.
You should compliment her design. It's very wonderful, and it makes her very happy.
And rightfully so, right? Because like one of the things that I've consistently heard back from everybody who's donated is how cool the website is, how great the art assets are, and well, full credit to Quinn on the text side of the logo. Yes, of course, yes. The one of the great things about that has been that, like, you know, Frances, that's all Frances's heroic efforts. Like, all those visual assets are her design. So definitely, like, you know, 3 cheers for that. who wants to go next?
Sure. I'm Kyle, he, they. I have way more education than any person should ever do, to the point where it's actually just kind of a sign that I was an idiot who should have just gotten out of school faster. I'm a co-owner, co-editor, obviously, at Strange Matters. My focus is on anthropological and cultural issues. My article has not yet, you'll get to see it when we do the full release in a couple of weeks, so keep us going, keep the momentum going, and we'll have that out for you. It is on colonialism in modern board game design. To give you the kind of obnoxious nerd that I am, who loves games but also loves to make them look as bad as possible, because I don't know, that's some sort of personality disorder where I have to make the things I love look bad. And so,
Kill your darlings.
Yeah, kill your darlings. Yeah. If my media loves cannot tolerate being put into the worst possible light and me still loving them, then I truly love them. That's my deal.
Yeah.
The problematic phase is this.
Yeah. My faves must be problematic, and I will deploy
Find
the
how.
latest technologies of problematization.
In fairness, some of the games that you discuss in that one don't need too much help to look
No, they don't need
problematic.
much.
I mean, Mombasa in particular, which I had never heard of before you wrote about it, is like one of the most obscene games I've ever seen. It's so funny.
It's a very cool game. It's like the worst part. Like I still was like, oh, this is really cool and exciting, but it's also like, this is also a nightmare. Like
it literally puts each of the players in control of like one of like the horrible, like, you know, like vicious European companies of like the 19th century.
No.
What?
No, you're mischaracterizing it. It puts you in the seat of being one of the horrible pillaging people in Africa. The companies, you can switch between loyalties freely.
Got you.
Which is part of what I found so fascinating, was that you can switch loyalties between the companies. And so the best strategy is to buy a company that's got a low stock price and get other players to make the stock value go up.
So
that's a fascinating mechanic. It's also just cast alongside just like being an absolute piece of shit.
Yeah, literally like genocidal capitalist colonialist pump and dump simulator.
Yeah.
Like
yeah. And not like critically either. I guess I want to be clear here. Like that could be handled critically. Mombasa does not handle it critically.
So that's Kyle, and then Quinn. I think that leaves us two.
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah, so I'm Quinn, he, they. I studied anthropology, I guess, since we're doing education and such. I studied anthropology and sociology in college, though I was much more on the archaeological side of those conversations than anything modern. Currently, I've spent my career in the festering shit pot that is the tech sector. And don't know, I married myself to that industry and I could never tell you why. And yeah, I've been kind of not present on a lot of the editor stuff because I've been on a, I don't know, I've been living on a mountaintop for the last like 90 days or something like that. So that's kind of why I have just not been around. So not like literally living on a mountaintop, but figuratively, I'm currently in a basement. So the exact opposite of that, but.
And Quinn is being too modest because in addition to an excellent background in both like anthropology, archaeology, and tech, they also taught themselves basically like industrial engineering for fun is my understanding, or at least the basic principles of it. And there's a big interest in that kind of manifests itself in your upcoming essay about the kind of biophysical aspects of the economy and how things work when you take away all the kind of like socially constructed aspects of economic stuff, but instead zero in on like how stuff is made, like what kinds of machines make it and like make other machines and so on and so forth.
I describe my interest in it as being kind of akin to the process that a caterpillar undergoes when it's in its cocoon and it just kind of dissolves into its organs before reforming into something else. It's kind of that notion, but apply that to economies of just dissolve everything but the vital organs and then just like rearrange that until you now have something that isn't horrible. That's how I describe it. Might be a bit of a visceral analogy. So.
I was gonna say.
the silence there kind of.
Out of the chrysalis
Wow,
of
I never
capitalism.
thought of it that way before.
There it comes. Never seen it that way again.
Butterfly.
I like
Beautiful.
Steve's thing there, out of the chrysalis of capitalism.
Yeah, it comes libertarian socialism.
That's the hope.
Marvel socialism.
A less gooey future.
I don't know if a butterfly is the best metaphor because butterflies die after like 3 days. So I don't think
That's true.
I
Yeah.
can make some very spicy historical statements around that, but I won't. So many revolutions truly died within 3 days as well. So
Well, maybe it's
Yeah.
butterflies as a whole. So,
Yes, I like.
yeah.
but the notion of the butterfly, the aesthetic concept of the
If,
butterfly,
Right.
yeah.
with the resilience of like lithotrophic bacteria who live for 3
Yeah.
days, eat rock, and never die. So
Right. So we've themed this month, right, as bottom up economics. Now that we're done with intros.
Oh,
Um,
actually,
John, no, you don't get an intro, John Mike.
yeah, I was
Oh
gonna
yeah,
say.
of course. Yeah, of course. Everyone knows who Tom Michael is.
Well,
Sorry.
That's what I
Go
get.
for
No,
it.
it's okay. That's what I get so much during it. I won't do too much. My name's John Michael Cologne, but friends call me JMC. Pronouns he, him. I studied comparative literature in undergrad, which is kind of like English, but you have to learn 2 languages that are not English, and it's like a lot more interdisciplinary. So it let me do like philosophy and intellectual history stuff, as well as studying like modernist literature from Latin America and Europe. And I guess yeah, I'm a Strange Matters co-editor and also a freelance writer. That's what I've been doing for the last couple of years. I mean, day jobs have been different things as I've been hopping from one to the other to pay my rent, and then the other side, all of that is really just to subsidize my ability to write for little magazines. I've written for The Point, Brooklyn Rail, a couple other places in these times, that kind of thing.
Right. So now I
Yes,
should be
sorry.
segueing, but now I'm fumbling. Right. So we decided to theme our April content because it did have a theme. We looked at it and it had a theme, and the theme was bottom-up economics, which was a delightful name.
Power to
Several
those on
other
the bottom.
associations. Yes, several other associations, we thought.
We ended up making some assets that emphasized it. I think it's worth sharing with the crew.
Really,
You know.
should we?
Juicy asset right
A
there.
juicy asset. That's
Oh my
exactly
God.
right.
Power bottom economics.
But our puerile and meme heavy sense of humor aside, it was, like Francis said, a theme that really did come from the bottom up, because we just realized that a lot of the content that we had lined up was on the same theme, so we figured we would discuss it together. Bottom up economics means a lot of things, or could mean a lot of things. So just throwing it out there for everybody, what does bottom up economics mean for you guys?
Well, what comes up first for me is it means you have not only democratic planning for industry and like productive processes, but also democratic execution and equitable execution. So like based upon whatever your abilities are. And then, and also economizing on scarce resources that were there prior to you and your group democratically doing things in an equitable way as well.
Yeah, socialists, especially libertarian socialists, talk a lot about self-management, right? Like the idea that workers in a workplace people living in a neighborhood should be the ones making their own decisions. And to the extent that we need larger scale coordination, it should come up out of those direct democratic units. But learning how to do that, that's not just something that like, we can, flick a policy switch and then people are doing it. It's like practice, like riding a bicycle. So part of what bottom-up economics would mean is kind of like, helping people to develop the skills to actually run their own lives, which they can only really learn by doing it. So I think that that's like a big selling point for this stuff is, the power that comes from people actually practicing. Like, it's one thing to talk about co-ops, but as somebody who has now kind of like, along with everybody else on this call, spent like, 2 years working on building a co-op, it's a very different experience to actually do it. But sometimes that's because it's harder, but sometimes it's because it's actually really inspiring, because it's like, wow, we really run the business as a democracy. Why don't we run everything like this? And then that's kind of like where the for me, those associations kind of are around that concept.
I'll take a
Right.
different
Yeah.
spin.
I mean, sorry, go for it, Quinn.
I was gonna say, I was gonna take a slightly different spin on it as viewing it, because there are a lot of different ways of looking at it. I see it as also kind of, to a certain degree, embodying a plan of action as well, as it regards to like dual power kind of institutions and structures, and that like if that's something that you're building, definitionally that's something we're building like from the bottom up. Like we have to kind of start from scratch on that kind of thing, because there isn't like, there's some stuff there. Like let's be very clear about that. There are some people who've done some amazing work already, and there are already some like wonderful seeds and stuff out there, but that's what all these things are right now, is it's still just a bunch of seeds. And like, how do you turn that from something small into something much bigger? And that fundamentally is a, that's a course of action of taking small things and growing them into bigger things.
That's a great interpretation that actually hadn't occurred to me yet. That
I love that.
we're like working from first principles, that we're like working on the foundations. And
I was thinking in a much more like physical sense, but yeah, also in like a theoretical sense as well. Like, back to the basics on theory as well, like building a theory of economics from the bottom up.
and something that occurs. Oh, sorry, Steve. Do you want to go?
And Quinn, you pointed out that there are lots of worker cooperatives, some of them pretty big. Like there's like the Mondragon Corporation is a network of cooperatives unto itself.
Favorite.
But it's like even in the US here, where it seems like there's almost no pull, there's actually several hundred worker cooperatives.
Yeah. There's also
at least.
or like
and
other organizations too, like Cooperation Jackson. Like those people are freaking cool as hell with what they do.
I think bottom-up economics, in addition to everything we've mentioned, is also like coordinating between setting up supply chains that work for each node in the proposed supply chain, where the worker has a say, but their business also has a say, and it works out to something equitable for everyone.
Yeah, and I've been like kind of interjecting throughout a somewhat separate point that like I keep coming back to. Is like, establishment economics makes boogeymen out of socialist programs and plans, like, or they poo-poo potential plans with like the realities of how the economy actually works. And I think building up, they sort of suggest that they have hard truths, when in reality, economics is much more malleable and much less perfect, much more sort of probabilistic than it's presented to be. And so things like proposing a UBI may get poo-pooed because, it's just going to make inflation run wild, when we don't actually know how inflation works. And so that's just kind of making it's kind of prematurely putting down a radical social program without really much to justify putting it down.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a favorite of most policymakers these days, is really just try to like come up with the flimsiest reasons not to do something that might be even mildly inconvenient for you. It's like you see stuff around like people will put forward a proposal to like retire the penny as a unit of currency in the United States, and people are like suddenly like just start predicting that if we ever did that, like the apocalypse would come and the entire U.S. economy would collapse because we don't mint one particular coin anymore. But like Australia and Canada already did that, and like they're doing okay. Like their economies are they're still kind of chugging along. So like it's this, you know, process that people love to do of just like find any reason not to do something. And if it's something that is against their interest or like a donor's interest, and then suddenly they're going to come up with any reason to not do it, no matter, like they will go to any lengths to make sure that they don't do that. So it's a frustrating.
Yeah, what I'm super excited to do is to like knock economists off their sort of high horses and bring them back down to the earth and have pragmatic conversations about like what they sort of talk in highfalutin language about. Yeah, and I think we do that with a number of our pieces so far, but there's so much more to work on.
If I may expand on one of those points, because I think
please
that's a
do.
great point. The specific way of bringing the economists back down to earth is, I think, actually another aspect of this bottom-up economics thing, because it's bottom-up also in the sense that, like, you know, part of the reason why economists and, you know, will bring up ideas that supposedly are like, you know, real reality, but then the predictions that are generated by those ideas fail to come to pass, and things that they would have predicted are impossible not only are possible but then happen. You know, part of the reason that happens is because the main way that economic ideas have been developed in the last like 100 years in the mainstream of economics, which is called neoclassical economics, has been a very like deductive method where you basically have like your armchair axioms that you stipulate, and then you just like create mathematical models that are basically just a series of deductions from those assumptions. So in other words, like, okay, if this is true, then this must be true, and this must be true, and this must be true, and you can put in a nice little math model with equations and so on, and it seems like it's like scientific because you've swapped out paragraphs for variables and so on. But it doesn't have anything to do with the real world. It's like a toy world. And theoretically, it's a toy world that captures some kind of like idealized aspect of the real world. But if it doesn't let you do stuff in the world successfully, then what's the point of it? And one of the nice things about the methods that you know, we have tried to employ at the very least, and which like the people who have inspired us, who are like, you know, like who have done research on economic subjects, what they have done is a kind of grounded approach where like they look at actual institutions that exist in the world and they analyze them sociologically or anthropologically. How has this worked, right? Like I can observe it, I can see how it works, I can compare it to other institutions that are similar or different, blah, blah. Going to like a workplace and talking to the workers and saying, how do you guys do this anyway? Or even business owners and asking them like, how do you set prices? How do you do this? How do you do that? And then building up models out of those observables, like, you know, which is not just collecting the facts in some neutral way. You are constructing models that then shape your assumptions, which determines what you see and what you don't see. But it's like more rooted in actual things that are in the world, so that like, you know, you're probably wrong in some way, but nevertheless, you're more liable not to just be completely barking up the wrong tree. And a lot of the theories that we respect and a lot of the theories that we're trying to kind of develop, which don't just come from economists, although some of them do, heterodox economists from the non-neoclassical schools, but also from anthropology and sociology, the supply chain literature, the business management literature, all that is grounded in this way. And we would consider that getting this knowledge from, you know, it's not just like the theoretical heights of macroeconomic, you know, theorists, you know, sitting in a journal and talking about big picture things like inflation, which, I mean, what even is inflation? Is it a coherent concept, blah, blah, but rather it's coming from actual people on the ground or from actual institutions, and then kind of bringing knowledge from people who have directly experienced things up into the realms of theory to try to kind of like, you know, to ground that theory.
Yeah, one of the, you know, really like one of the more startling examples, I think, of like how the neoclassical economics people will react to like actually trying to go out and do that kind of thing, like actually collecting data on how do people act, like how do things in the economy actually operate and function. I think about like the controversy, and I mean, you know, to be clear, this discipline of economics thought has its own whole mess of issues, but the drama that played out I found absolutely fascinating, which was the behavioral economists over like the 2000s and 2010s kind of came along and said like, hey, so like maybe like humans aren't like these like hyper rational robotic, like, you know, calculating decision makers who have like a massive spreadsheet of the implicit qualitative utility of every decision that they're ever going to make, and they like use these complex mathematics to figure out like, okay, well, I'm going to buy this brand of toilet paper. Maybe they're actually a little like, maybe there are other forces at play in how people operate in an economy, and like well, first off, the neoclassical people just like flipped out and lost their mind at this. And I think their common refrain is like, in aggregate, which is the phrase they always deploy when they want to erase basically any behavior in an economy of any kind. They'll just, well, in aggregate, these behaviors really just even out, and it all really just follows this model. And I remember when the Nobel Prize actually went out to one of the behavioral econ guys, and like they threw a fit. Like people were pissed that this behavioral econ guy got a Nobel Prize because he challenged one of, as John Michael said, one of these supreme axioms of rational behavior.
To the point of rational behavior and rational expectations theory from neoclassical economics, one of the ways, so like one of the rational expectations that they use in their modeling is the firms are profit maximizers, and specifically they minimize their costs, or so we're told. And then when you look at the surveys though, surveys of business owners about how they keep track of their costs and when they raise prices and stuff like that, if you are a firm who makes inputs that are then bought by someone else to make some further product that's sold on, we don't see cost minimization. Like firms are not really cost minimizers in actuality. They want to maintain good relationships with their suppliers. They aren't going to just constantly haggle at the lowest dollar for every single deal.
Oh yeah,
so it's really hard to call them cost minimizers.
Yeah, having worked in corporate sales, like you don't do that. Like people will cut like really wild deals, and sometimes it is purely out of like a personal relationship with the person in the other company.
Yeah, it's to establish goodwill.
Yeah, other times it's so other times it's purely altruistic. Other times it's just like, I have got to make these numbers this quarter, so I'm just going to sell this at a lower price than I should, because like that's the only way I'm going to like hit my sales numbers this quarter. And like, so sometimes it's based upon like the incentives of an individual's jobs, and they're just like, I got to hit my quota. Like,
it's like, so it's now does the fact that the goodwill stuff rather than haggling plays out mean that these capitalists are somehow nice guys? No, it just means that it's a lot muddier than the picture presented in neoclassical economics.
Yeah, well, it's fundamentally all of the economy is like, kind of when you get down to it, could be described as being essentially like a social process, and it's going to behave in the way that societies do, which is complexly.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I always feel like I need to point out, that like individual positions don't have a straightforward key tracking indicator that's just profitability. I used to work in recruiting, HR recruiting stuff, and people look at job listings and they'll say, okay, you need 5 years experience for an entry-level job, right? We've all seen those job listings. The most infamous one being, oh, we want 5 years experience with this programming language, when the programming is only 2 years old.
The guy who invented it got rejected.
Yeah, the guy who invented it was, well, this is where it gets very funny, is like, when you're writing those positions, you are not actually responsible for like making it the best description you can. You're held responsible for getting it out on time and making sure it looks like a job description as part of a writing genre. So if you have like, let's say, usually you'll have about 6 qualifications on there. 2 of them are the real qualifications. 4 of them you put on there to make it look like a job application. And this kind of shit, where 2/3 of the stuff you're putting out there is complete bullshit that you are just slapping down to get your boss to leave you alone so you can go home.
Yeah.
That's iterated in every field 1 million times.
Yeah, many of the concerns that people assume, like the actual capitalist is constantly managing themselves, are actually delegated out, and then people are given KPIs, key performance indicators, that may or may not be profitability.
Oh yeah,
there may be just simply unit counts. They like, you need to get a certain number of units out.
When I was in my, well, soon to be former job, it was in services, and we had to track our hours. And I know people who, in tracking their hours, it would be like, okay, well, I sent an email that took 5 minutes, but based upon like a lot of the stuff and the hours that I have left on the project, I'm just gonna say that it took 30 minutes and go take a walk for a while. Like that's people do that because it's like, well, I got spare hours left. I'll just, take some time off on company time. People do that. It's not a malicious thing. It's just like it's the
Right.
structure of the incentive and the structure of the corporation and the social dynamics on the teams.
So I think that this gives a pretty broad overview of the kinds of discussions that we want to have in the magazine. And, this is very different from the way that both mainstream economics and, I would argue, socialist magazines on the whole talk about this stuff because, we've talked about the problems with mainstream economics, but then one of the issues that happens in the socialist sphere is that people talk a lot about politics. They'll talk a lot about like theory. They'll talk, right? Like, read theory.
Policy.
No, I
Yeah.
have one of like, okay, so on the inversion of like the profit thing of thinking that like every single corporate decision is made with these really, really like complex like profitability matrices on like every conceivable like, pen that is used in the office. There's a socialist edition of this, which is kind of like, thankfully, like not many people really do this, but there are people out there who seem to have this mindset that like the economic elites actually have this like secret, super sophisticated understanding of like material dialectics and stuff, and like are thinking in like socialist terms, and that's how they like actually operate. When like the reality is like most of these like rich people like have never even like seen capital in physical form, much less like read the book. Like most of them are like very like staunch adherents to like neoclassical capitalist economics. They're very like earnest in their belief that this is how you eliminate poverty. They're like usually like much more like fixated on like, how do I make sure my next car is more expensive than my neighbor's car right now?
Right.
Like, it's very mundane, boring stuff. And it's not like it's not quite the conspiratorial cabal that, I mean, sometimes it can be, some of them definitely hit that level, but like for the most part, it's really boring. And like, it's a different set of forces that, can create, as I guess call it like, class solidarity among the elites or whatever, like that, that kind of behavior is much more like systemic and is much more like emerges as a force like between people much more than like a conscious behavior.
Yeah, I would just say that I think for me, the biggest distortion that occurs in socialist discussions of how capitalist society works is actually, it's not, for me, it's not even like the distortions, although that's certainly one, and there's others that I could go on about, but for me, it's just how little it's actually talked about in the media that's supposed to be, we're the people who want to reconstruct the economy along democratic lines, right? So you'd think that we would talk more about how the economy works, like, and like specific elements of it that we want to change and why, and like proposing models for how one might do so, case studies of like, similar examples in history or in other societies. But that is actually not the content that you'll find in even like very serious and otherwise very good, intellectual literary magazines that are socialist. And then kind of like the further out you get from that into like the podcast sphere or into like BreadTube and stuff like that, it diminishes even more like the kind of like, seriousness of that kind of like, economic analysis, until eventually you reach a point where people are really like kind of just talking about like like left-wing celebrity culture and like each other like social media beefs and stuff like that. And it just kind of is totally divorced from concrete questions of like what is to be done in particular discrete sectors of life and problems that we urgently have to confront. So that's part of what the magazine is ultimately about trying to do, like in some of these articles that we put together.
Doing bottom-up economics, it kind of requires those conversations to happen because people have to have some understanding of those things. If it's going to be an actual bottom-up system and not some technocratic bureaucratic system, it requires that those conversations happen at all levels.
Yeah. So do we want to get into some of these articles? I think that might be a good way of giving like a teaser.
Yeah, I mean, we've already published one of them.
That's right.
Steve's inflation article, and it was discussed on Varnblog recently, and we released a Twitter summary of it last week, Monday, to complement the podcast. But where do we start with it?
Well,
Steve, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, do you want to give us a little just capsule
Sure.
summary of your argument?
Lowdown.
Yeah, so along the theme of bottom-up economics, quite honestly, I was looking at existing theories of inflation, which seem to be usually of the type of looking at one macroeconomic indicator, and then you look at another macroeconomic indicator, and then you compare how they moved against each other and said, well, one of these is indicative of an inflationary buildup, like there's too much pressure in the economy, or it's heating up or something. And then people quite naturally ask, like, okay, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean for me or for like my company or supply chain of companies or something? And I was like, I know there are ethnographic studies essentially that show how people set prices. And by which I mean, people went out and did real science and made observations about how prices are set. Inflation is generally defined as a general rise in prices. Ergo, I should be able to build up a theory of inflation using survey data from how people set prices when they actually increase it. And so in the paper, I kind of taxonomize the existing theories into a couple groups. There's one that's based on the quantity of money that's already out there somehow causing inflation, a quantity theory of money. Then there's another one that is saying, okay, well, demand is pulling more money into buying things. There's demand pull theories that say that, like, well, an increase in demand is causing increases in prices. And there's another one that says costs are increasing for businesses and they push up prices all by themselves. And then there's another group that's kind of a mixture of the demand pull and the cost push. And so for those different taxonomical groups, I run through what's already there. And what I found was the way that they talk about inflation is still incredibly confused. Like, they'll mix and match whatever seems to be working given phenomena that happen to be occurring alongside inflation, but they don't get to like what causes inflation or even like what inflation is. Like, they lose sight of the fact that, like, we're talking about prices. So first, as the economist J.W. Mason said, any theory of inflation is necessarily a theory of prices. So I kind of take that as my starting point and say, like, okay, prices are being set, but by whom? By people, by individual people in companies whose job it is typically to set prices. If it isn't the capitalists themselves, then it's someone they've delegated the authority to. And I pretty much take it from there. I look at I use the grounded theory approach, which we alluded to earlier, and say, like, okay, well, who are these people? What are their constraints? What rules, when they do raise prices, by what rules does it happen? And what we see in the survey is prices are actually rather stable. They don't go up or down very often, but when they do go up, it seems to occur across as a response to build up in their costs, and their costs are someone else's price. And what are most of their costs going to be? The prices of other people along their supply chain. So I'm like, okay, inflation must propagate along supply chains. And that's how I build up my theory, basically, is I say that if there is an inflationary episode occurring, it's very likely that it occurs along a supply chain when someone, after changing all of the non-price variables as much as they can in order to deal with some sort of cost buildup, either from outside of their supply chain, like COVID-19 is going on or something that's causing disruptions, or within it, like a supplier, for whatever reason, doesn't have enough inputs to sell, maybe. In either case, it seems to be that there's a supply chain issue going on that eventually leads to someone breaking ranks and increasing their price. And then from there, it becomes more tenable sort of politically along the supply chain for other people to do the same. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just really want to emphasize to folks, Steve already said this, but just to like really hammer it home, like how important it is on a fundamental level that that he's reconfigured in this essay, like the discussion around inflation, from a discussion about this thing called inflation that happens supposedly across the whole economy, or across what is called the price level, which is a kind of abstract aggregate of all the prices in the economy, or actually the way that it's measured is all the prices that are deemed to matter for ordinary consumers, but that's a whole other kind of thing. So like the discussion going from that, right, to a discussion of what causes price rises, period. And then as a secondary question, what can cause price rises to travel like across large sectors of the economy? So it's going from an approach that treats inflation as this thing that happens like on the large scale, as like a singular thing that happens to well, actually, I mean, I'll go even further, right? Why do we talk about inflation as like a single thing? We talk about it that way as like the intellectual historical legacy of the quantity theory of money, which says that money is a commodity with a price. And if there's more of it, it's less valuable, so the price goes down. So therefore, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Inflation is something that happens to money. Money becomes less valuable and therefore can buy you less things if there's more of it. Now, very few people believe nowadays, who are like real economists, the unadulterated version of the quantity theory of money. Usually what they do is that they've rephrased it to be about the price level. And many of them kind of like have gradually moved away from the idea of it being like the absolute number of dollars circulating to these kinds of like hybrid models of one sort or another that will say, well, it's the number of dollars relative to industrial output, or they'll say it's, you know, it's about like, you know, cost push, where the biggest cost that affects the whole economy is wages. So basically inflation, and it always boils down to some kind of wage phenomenon. But they're still talking about like, you know, they're moving away from this paradigm, which failed and will always fail because it's wrong, but they still haven't broken with it entirely because they've maintained its kind of, you know, large scale cosmic view of inflation as this single unitary phenomenon across the whole economy. So Steve's piece is really radical because, and you know, he's not alone, right? He's building on a literature that already exists, but it's a very eloquent and radical statement of this different approach. What if we just got rid of the idea of there being like a singular inflation and instead talked about price rises? What causes price rises? How do they travel? And what causes a situation like the ones that we observe and call inflation, where prices across the economy go up? And that's basically the story that he tries to tell in the piece.
Which I think also leads to a really fun question out of that piece, which is why are capitalistic economies as they're currently run so susceptible to inflation? Why is it so damaging to them? And like, how does it end up actually, like, if it does happen, how does it harm people, or when does it harm people? Sometimes it doesn't have a harming effect. Sometimes it's completely like non-issue, you know. Other times it's catastrophic. Sometimes it's a rise in prices of one good is disastrous, whereas in another good, nobody's even going to notice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that part of why it's so damaging is partly due to the widespread misunderstanding of what is happening. So it's like you're able to point to like, well, now the market price is this, so I mean, we all just have to accept that, right? We talk about prices in the sense that like God said it, basically. Nobody really is responsible for this. I mean, this is just how the market functions.
Prices are a supernatural force.
No, I really think Varn, when I was on Varn's podcast, he was like, I just sort of assume market price is just a stand-in for God, or something like that. It's like, you know, that makes a lot of sense
hanging
to me.
over.
That was the entire opening to my piece that I did, was that exact like mindset, how it's like, you know, it's just,
so it's like it's no one's fault
priesthood.
really, I think, is like the function of saying like, well, I mean, supply and demand, so I mean, I had to raise my price.
It's the capitalist equivalent of just following orders.
And you know, there are softer there are softer versions of this that I'm very sympathetic to the view, actually, that when people say that, well, my costs increase and I tried not to raise prices, but eventually I had to because of my revenue constraint. And it's like, sure, under certain circumstances, that makes total sense to me. I think on one level, that is what's happening, but on another level, you're searching for a pretext that will be accepted more gently
Yeah.
with your
Well, you know,
suppliers and with the public at large.
a
Yep.
really good example of that right now that's been playing out has been, and then this just kind of gets into my own nerdy obsessions, but it's been graphics cards, where the prices on those spiked. And God, the number of excuses people tried to come up for it were incredible when it really just came down to crypto mining was just siphoning all these cards. And like at first they're like, oh, well, it's like increasing in the pandemic and stuff like that. And it's also like disruptions to supply chains from the pandemic and stuff. And it was like no other chip experienced this. It was specifically graphics cards experienced this. And it was tied directly to cryptocurrency, like with an insane level of correlation. And what started to happen, and this is starting to get a little bit muddled now because of some of the last like week or so, but up until about a week ago, it was the pricing on new graphics cards, because of course all the prices started to skyrocket, even though the manufacturing costs didn't budge at all. The prices were skyrocketing, and the graphics card manufacturers started releasing new cards that were at these inflated market price levels, the MSRP. So like what NVIDIA or AMD tells the manufacturers, like, this is what you should be selling this for. So they started to, like, instead of doing the old MSRPs, the new ones started to match the ultra inflated prices. And in part because these companies were experiencing just insane profits from like the prior quarters, because the increased prices they didn't have any increased, expenses, and so it was purely just going straight into the company's coffers. And so they started to change their behavior and take it as an excuse to permanently increase the price of cards.
Yep.
Now it started to change a little bit, so I don't know if that prediction is really going to continue to hold, but that's kind of like, that's been the trend up until about the last 7 days.
And
Yeah.
and the fundamental problem is it's very difficult to tell looking from the outside, which is the case, because one question, right, is, okay, so if capitalists, especially in large scale firms, don't have the ability to raise prices and kind of say like, oh, well, our costs went up, so we had to raise it, why don't they do it in normal times? I mean, and in fact, like a theory like monopoly capital theory, from like the 60s, some people who are more Marxist watching this have probably heard of like Paul Barron and Paul Sweezy, the Pauls, as I like to call them. They came up with the whole theory, which is basically that, like, yeah, like you can just jack up prices. And this has precedence in like anti-monopoly stuff from at the turn of the 20th century as well. Like, if you're a large company, you can just raise prices because you're not going to lose your customers or whatever. But that's not really, you look at it and it's more complicated because, people who have looked at actual markets, whether they're bourgeois theorists, like, I actually forgot his first name, but there's this famous business management researcher called Porter who came up with a book called Competitive Strategy. I forget, is it Ray Porter? It's something Porter. Or you're talking, or people who are more like left-wing social democratic, people like PWS Andrews, who was a Keynesian, British Keynesian economist in like the 40s. When you actually look at how large-scale firms operate, yeah, they might be a monopoly in one product, sort of, where they have very large market share for that product, but they have a bunch of product lines, and the more that they grow, the more they're kind of reliant on like regular revenues from that product line. So if somebody enters one of the markets that they're not focusing on behind their back, they could potentially, and like undercuts them in price or something, they could potentially like get squeezed for market share that could actually endanger like, their departments or their bottom lines or something like that. And so oligopolistic companies usually only compete with each other because the little guys can't compete with them. That much is true. But, oftentimes it's more complicated because they're competing with each other across different product lines. It's like the war of the big giants. And so therefore, the monopoly capitalist theory story that says that, like, the big firms can just raise prices whenever they want, and that's like the superpower that they have, is not really true. So why then, which explains also why prices were so stable before 2020. So why then after 2020 are we getting all this stuff? And that kind of is the fundamental question.
Yeah, even companies who are at the heights of their industry, the ones who are listed in the S&P 500 with like revenue in the billions every year, they also exercise restraint in normal times, quote unquote. Like they seem to need pretexts of one sort or another, at least to justify what they do. And it's certainly not due to their revenue constraint.
Sometimes
Like it would be for small and medium-sized firms. The large ones like are often accused of price gouging, which is like setting it not because your costs increased per se, but just because you want better earnings or something. And in order to defend your moat, as the investment analysts grade them on.
Well, I mean,
Morningstar analysts, like they literally have a rubric by which they grade companies for defending their product line, like their ability to, if they, in like a vacuum, basically, how far could they set their prices up or down and have a decent amount of customers still. And if it's very large, that's really good. It means people are far away from you in terms of like their pricing power, and like you have control, the analysts say, over at least that product. You don't see this type of monopoly power over lots and lots of products, as James C notes. It's just like one or two here and there. But even those large companies they still have to have a ready set of pretexts available in order to sell their price increase to people, at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, there's also kind of again, dragging it back in, social components as well as those price rises, wherein like companies are actually like oftentimes very concerned about developing overly negative images, even if they don't actually have all that much to strictly lose over it. It's kind of like infamously, what was the private military firm? It wasn't BlackRock. That's a capital company.
Shit.
Why can't I think of their name? They're infamous.
Yes.
Black River, Black Creek, Blackstone. I don't remember. Blackwater. There we go. I don't know why that was so hard to remember, but like, okay, so this is the company that does not sell anything to any of us. Like, none of us are gonna be like, hey, I need like a platoon of artillery to like escort me to my job this morning. Like, none of us are buying this.
They don't have television ads.
Yeah, well, they sell exclusively to, well, not exclusively, but almost exclusively to state actors. And at the end of the day, though, they still ended up changing their name because the press was so bad and everybody knew that everyone was like, Blackwater, these people are some awful motherfuckers. And so everybody was like, started to hate these people, and they ended up changing their name, even though like it wasn't really going to impact their government contracts, because like the military didn't really care. Like they were like, it was a company, it was a firm that was providing services, and they didn't really have any objective issue with them as far as the Pentagon was really concerned. They still did it though. And it's kind of like public image. Like if you're being a really awful corporation, that can get you in deep trouble. I mean, we saw that with AT&T back in like the mid-century period, where they were a monopoly, and they weren't like totally like off the rails, like trying to like squeeze like a percentage of everyone's income out of them. Like they definitely were not like a fun company to deal with, but like they were not like horrific. But they developed such a negative public image because dealing with them was so miserable that it ultimately led to them getting trust busted, because it hit a point where like even the senators could not get away with like ignoring this company's behavior and its monopoly. And and that can play out in other ways too, where if everyone knows you as a company that's horrible in some capacity, or is like if you're just being raising prices ludicrously high, if as John Michael mentioned, you have products in other verticals where you don't have, or in other sectors where you don't have that monopoly, you could lose business badly in those areas simply on the basis of like, yeah, well, I have to pay these people for my internet, but there is absolutely, actually this is a great example, is Optum. They're trying to sell me cell phone service, and I'm never buying cell phone service from them because I have dealt with their internet before, and that is enough of a pain in the neck. And they're like one of the only, it's like, look, there's 2 companies in New York that does internet, and yeah, I'm never buying Optimum's phone service because they're dealing with them for internet is such a miserable experience. And that could happen to essentially any company if they are, you know, being like stupid about their price setting. So there are sensitivities that we wouldn't normally expect out of companies that are ostensibly just profit maximizers that don't care about anything else. There are other weird dynamics that can be at play.
Yeah, similar to, I mean, the theme is like, is there, do really large firms opportunistically raise prices in order to juice up their revenues in advance of earnings calls? Yes, absolutely. Is that all there is to inflation? No, absolutely not. The small and medium companies clearly have revenue constraints that they hit up against during all manner of either external or internal shocks to supply chains. And even the large ones can get caught up, like in COVID, like where you have just entire plants that shut down because you're not allowed to have workers there. And then they had to do the PPP loans in order to keep a bunch of big companies afloat, ones who weren't really supposed to be applying through that, but they got it anyway.
Yeah,
There's like a lot of it's great oversight over their program, by the way. But yeah, like even large companies have their power does not just go around unchecked. And like sometimes they have legitimate fears. Other times they fear something that they don't really need to, because it's still ultimately people operating in a fog of war, basically, who don't have all the facts, but just use rules of thumb still. And, yeah.
I mean, everything they do is ultimately self-serving. It's just the decisions they make aren't necessarily going to be self-serving.
It's not like it's not rational optimizing behavior.
Yeah, it might not be apparent to us why that they're acting in their own interest. They always are, just about, but the reasons are going to be a little bit more messy than just revenue each quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And they can also just choose other things that are in their interests besides optimizing revenue, right? Like which anyway, you operate under too much uncertainty to really optimize it in any way. But like, you know, like prioritizing it, we can say. But they can prioritize other things. They can take a hit to revenue to expand their market share. They can choose to build out a new division because they want to build up a new core competency. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you can do once you're in that position. You're not a utility maximizer, a revenue optimizer, or any of these other kinds of functions in equations. You're a person with agency, and therefore you can choose to do one thing or the other thing.
Are you saying that corporations are people?
Well, there's certainly a bunch of
they're composed of people.
Sorry.
There's certainly a bunch of committees of people.
Yeah.
Whether they should be legal people, I mean, well, you know, it can be useful, but can also not. I had a thing I wanted. I drew a little picture.
Oh my gosh, James.
As you can tell, I'm the one who draws all the amazing, you know.
Yeah, John Michael's our actual graphic designer.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So right here.
But I wanted to do this because, and we should probably move on soonish after this so that we can cover the other articles. But this is really important to our whole ethos, the explaining what a supply chain is. So we've been throwing around this word, but I think it's really important, and it's on my mind a lot because I got a certificate in supply chain management recently. A lot of what Strange Matters puts out is going to kind of operate under a model that talks about supply chains, and the inflation piece is no exception. Steve calls his theory the supply chain theory of inflation. All that means is that rather than inflation being this thing that, again, happens on like this like economy-wide scale or something, it happens within particular supply chains. So let's say that like we're talking about, like I don't know, what's an industry? Ketchup. Okay. Here's ketchup, right? Like, you know, this is the food processing plant that makes ketchup. This is the retailer that sells the ketchup to you, right? Like, you know, so like, I don't know, Heinz puts together the thing and sends it to Walmart, and then you buy it at Walmart. And then over here is your tomato grower like, you know, is growing the tomatoes that are turned into ketchup at the food processing plant. This relationship is not the kind of neutral relationship of just isolated agents, you know, buying cheap and selling dear that oftentimes, well, no, that not just oftentimes, which is the basis of like the general equilibrium models at the core of neoclassical, you know, economics. Rather, this is a very like specific relationship of interdependency. These aren't just like isolated agents who could just as easily trade with anybody else. They are in a long-term relationship with each other to supply one another and ultimately like provision each other such that this tomato grow like in order for you to get your ketchup, you need to go to Walmart. In order to have the ketchup to sell you, Walmart has to get it from the ketchup manufacturer. In order to manufacture the ketchup, they need the tomatoes that they get from here. And this is just a linear chain. Supply chains, in fact, are networks. So it's not just as simple as like this single line. There's stuff coming out over here. There's like, you know, there's like a whole network of that interconnects
Cyclical
ultimately the
networks.
the entire economy. I mean, like, what is the economy on a fundamental level? It's these networks of supply chains that ultimately form a circuit that kind of doubles back on itself. You know, and then to the extent that like you have a global economy, it's because, you know, within like, you know, the supply chains will go out to other countries. And then there's like permanent ongoing relationships of interdependency between them that we can call the global economy or the North American economy or the European economy or the Eurasian economy or whatever.
You may have seen, to anyone who's watched our pitch video, you may have seen graphics that illustrate supply chains flying over Steve's head as he speaks.
Yeah.
Which is so good. It's like, I think it was like government and
I have my like conspiratorial thing going behind me.
Like,
Yeah.
and then like the equations.
Right. So the reason why this is important is because in the context of the inflation thing is that if you have a sudden huge increase in the price of tomatoes, which actually happened during COVID because of the labor shortage, right? Pandemic is happening. People who have to be in person can't be in person, or if they try to be, they get really sick. So production comes to a halt in something like agriculture, right? Where like you have to have people who are there. They have, you know, that means that you might miss the tomato harvest, which happened in many different places, which means that there was a shortage of tomatoes, which means that there was a shortage of ketchup. And like, ultimately, people were trying really hard not to raise their prices, but eventually those pressures, because not having the materials that you need raises your business costs. It's kind of a long story why, but it does. Like ultimately, they had to make the decision to raise prices even though they didn't want to. And that kind of like, you know, traveled up the chain, because if these guys raise prices, then these guys have to raise prices because their prices is these guys' costs. And if these folks raise prices, you know, that's now an upper cost for these. So they have to raise their prices. And then you buying the end product have to pay a higher price. And so you can see that there's a price increase that travels across a supply chain. And we see these dynamics all the time. And this is what accounts for what we call inflation, because when you have an event that disrupts a number of key nodes in this network of supply chains, like the pandemic, or other examples include like, you know, like famines or natural disasters of other sorts, or a balance of payments crisis where, you know, the exchange rate makes anything imported way more expensive, and like, you know, those imports are inputs into domestic industries. All of that can cause price increases that travel across supply chains. And that, I mean, you can demonstrably use this to explain price increases in, for example, Cuba last year, or in Lebanon, where it happened recently as well. Those were both balance of payments crises, and a lot of the inflation. But you can also use it to explain price increases in China right now due to the coal shortage. And see, that's a biophysical cause for it, right? Like, you know, is they actually, like, you know, we're having trouble getting coal because of COVID, and so therefore, like, you know, and actually ended up cornering the global coal market, which is crazy and underreported. So that's kind of like, you know, the dynamics that we're talking about. And it's not a perfect explanation, because sometimes you do get corporations jacking up prices because the news says that there's inflation, so they can do it under the cover. But it's very difficult to know unless you look at the actual balance sheets of the actual companies and see what is going on, or talk to people who are in labor or management at those companies and see what the hell is going on. And that's basically like the upshot of the whole theory. We want people to figure out what the hell is going on by actually talking to people, actually looking at particular corporations and particular supply chains, you know, and the price and the particular people who are setting those particular prices, as opposed to generalizing, you know, from a cosmic view of like, you know, the price level of the whole economy, which doesn't even make sense.
It was that example that you had about the ketchup thing. Like, there's like a weird like side effect of that could potentially emerge where, like, so the ketchup people aren't buying the bottles from the bottler anymore. So suddenly the bottlers have a massive excess in capacity in bottling, and they need to bottle things. And so they'll start selling their bottling capacity at a lower cost. So suddenly the mustard people are like getting increased revenue margins because the bottling costs just dropped down. So while like one product is spiking in price, another is going down concurrently. Right. Its price is probably not going to go down because they don't usually lower the prices, but like their revenue margins are going to suddenly increase, which is like a weird counterintuitive thing, because like, well, you know, in the, you know, colloquial understanding of inflation, it's like, well, all prices have to go up. Well, no, they don't necessarily. Some prices might remain totally the same. Others could potentially go down. In a lot of cases, you might see people whose revenue shares start to increase. I mean, you saw a lot of the shutdowns during COVID. Like that happened a lot during COVID, where just because of like the wacky changes that happened, you know, with the disruptions in, you know, travel and stuff like that. Like, my God, plane tickets during COVID, like, you know, suddenly you're having shortages and price increases in ketchup. Meanwhile, plane tickets are dirt cheap because nobody wants to fly.
Right. And when we've said a few times that like companies will use other tools than price before moving their prices around in the presence of supply chain shocks first. That doesn't come out of nowhere either. In March of 2020, when everything started shutting down, we didn't immediately see price changes. It took about 9 months to a year before we saw the inflation that we're in right now begin to really happen.
I remember we were
So
talking
the
about
companies were doing other things like slowing down their production and rationing inputs, sending people home, furloughing them and stuff. And then later they raised prices.
And not to put Steve on a pedestal of genius here, Steve and John Michael, but like I remember when a lot of the early COVID stuff was happening, I remember them making a lot of predictions around like how the inflation would play out, and that was before the inflation model was really even like starting to fully take form. Like it was still very in preliminary stages, but even with that, like you guys were making predictions that very closely mirror a lot of the things that have been happening over the last like 12 to 18 months. So like, not to put you in a comfortable spot here, but you did kind of call some of this stuff source. Just trust me, bro.
And I'm glad too that happened, because like we did that in print, so we can, like, people can check the dates of when we were saying that. Well, on Twitter,
Twitter threads on some of those, yeah,
and
more
like,
recent ones.
You know, and that's not really any great genius of ours. It's because we were trying to find the models that were most grounded in reality that other people had developed, and kind of expand on them and things like that. And you know, like, it's if you do work with those kinds of models of how things work that are derived from actual observations, your predictions are going to be better. And it's just kind of a pity that you know, both among like capitalist apologists and among like, you know, self-described socialists, you see very little attention to these kinds of ways of looking at things. So do we want to move to another article? We've talked about inflation for quite a bit, but I think it's nice because it sets up some of the other stuff that we're going to talk about. Which one do folks want to talk about next?
Well, do we want to talk about history of Chartalism, since we're since you're in the brain fog of doing final edits of it before we publish next week?
Yes.
Sumeria.
Actually, I actually vote for the Mesopotamians.
Mesopotamians.
Yeah, just
no, we're not going to talk about anything else now. This is now Mesopotamia magazine.
Yeah, this is Quinn. Do you want to elaborate a little on why we're so obsessed with ziggurats?
Oh,
we're in our Babylonian madness.
Yeah, the Babylonian madness. I don't think I've well, actually that's not true. I have suffered. I think my affliction of Babylonian madness was a little ahead of Steve and John Michaels, but I also suffered through this particular disease. There's this interesting thing that happens when you start to study of all societies. Very specifically, it is ancient Sumeria, Babylon, the ancient Near East, and you start studying these societies, and you just start to run into these like things that like it's weird. It's simultaneously things that echo our world in a very uncanny way, but also like every conceivable configuration and difference from how things currently work. It's like, because what you're dealing with is a society that was, societies more accurately, like, this isn't just like one like monolithic state or something like that. This is dozens of cultures, probably more accurately, hundreds of cultures over thousands of years, dozens and dozens of different polities and city-states and kingdoms and empires. And it's just this whole course of history for, 2000 plus some odd years, depending on how you want to actually demarcate the start and the end, in which just every conceivable like configuration of like history and human dynamics plays out in some form or another, despite the fact that this is taking place like 2,000 years ago. It's the infamous thing with the guy with the complaint about the bad copper. It's like you run into these things
Ea-Nasir.
Yeah, Ea-Nasir with his terrible
It
copper.
became a meme.
Yeah, it's a
Literally.
meme now.
How
It's
crazy
incredible.
is that?
I'll share it with our viewers.
Yeah, it's this incredible time period in history that even though we don't even have all that much writing, we do have a substantial volume because they wrote everything in clay and that stuff never breaks apart. So if you happen to find a library, like it's all going to be intact probably. So we have this very substantial body of written work that tells us an enormous amount about this time period. And in particular, some of the more fascinating aspects of it too also revolve around the development of these things. And it's not just like the inheritance of let's say because these societies eventually ended, right? And like societies came after them. But some of the things that they developed didn't have to get redeveloped again, right? So like if you're looking at Sumeria, you are watching like literally the invention of money is taking place during this civilization's or this series of civilizations lifespan. And you see this in plenty of other places in the world around the same time, or at any point they have like an agricultural revolution, certain things like monetary systems start to emerge. But in Sumeria, it's just so clearly documented for us that you can watch as banking starts to emerge, as loans and debt start to emerge, as contracts start to emerge, as eventually like minting coins and such start to develop. And that's I think that's part of why it just becomes such an obsession, is you can watch this experimental phase and this evolution of this thing from not existing to suddenly dominating the society over the course of its lifespan. On top of just all of these other things that are just like these simultaneous echoes of our society and also wild divergences. I think the one with the contracts where like as a debt thing, in case of default, it was like you had to like adopt the creditor as a son or something like that.
Yeah.
So that if you defaulted, they inherited your estate, and that was the collateral system. And so like it's like this strange version of like what we do of like, okay, well, if you like go bankrupt, like we're just going to repossess all of these things, and they have like a legal thing for that. They didn't really have this, and so they had to like create some strange legal structure to allow for it, and that was adoption.
Well, the adoption thing was, I always feel like this is very fun to point out. The adoption thing also gets into like gender conceptions in a really fun way, because the actual law on the books was that you used to be able to have you just default and the creditor gets your farm. This was bad from the king's perspective for the social engineering that kings wanted to do. And so what they fought for was, what they changed the law to was, farms can only change hands to inheritance.
Yeah.
So so they just went the extra step of, now you have to adopt your creditor as your son.
Right.
Where that gets even more fun is that son is not defined in these legal codes as having anything to do with masculinity. So it's quite common for women to be adopted as somebody's son.
In order to
Okay.
get their,
Yeah.
in order basically to repo their land.
Yeah.
And I believe we made a meme of that one. It's like, look at me, I'm your son now.
Yeah.
I think there's only one thing I would add on to the Babylonian thing. I guess like the closing note about this is that this is not like an isolated thing where like we've gone through like the quote unquote Babylonian madness. That is actually a term that Keynes developed when he was talking about his encounter and studying. I think he described it as like a year where he was just reading nothing but research about the Mesopotamians because he found it so fascinating. And so like this is a thing that happens a lot to people. It's just this strange quirk where like you stumble across like histories of Mesopotamia and suddenly it's just like for like 6 to 12 months, 6 to 18 months, you're just obsessed with Mesopotamia and all of the weird and wacky things with it. It's incredibly cool. And if you've never read much about them, I highly encourage, perusing the Wikipedia article or finding a book or watching some videos or something like that, but it's definitely worth it. Oh yes, here we go. The Ea-Nasir copper. This man whose shady business dealings 4,000 years later, we're still remembering.
Oh my God, Achilles.
I'm still laughing about it.
It's so good.
That is why no one will remember your name.
And I actually, to give people a little sense of the context, I actually found the letter, which is really short, and it gives people an idea of what that meme is about. Francis, since you brought it up, do you want to read it or should I?
You go for it.
Okay. Tell Ea-Nasir, Nani sends the following message. When you came, you said to me as follows, I will give Gimilsin when he comes fine quality copper ingots. You left then, but you did not do what you promised me. You put ingots which were not good before my messenger Sitsin and said, if you want to take them, take them. And if you do not want to take them, then go away. What do you take me for that you treat somebody like me with such contempt? I have sent as messengers gentlemen like ourselves to collect the bag with my money deposited with you, but you have treated me with contempt by sending them back to me empty-handed several times, and that through enemy territory. Is there anyone among the merchants who trade with Telmun who has treated me in this way? You alone treat my messenger with contempt. On account of that one trifling mina of silver which I owe you, you feel free to speak to me in such a way, while I have given to my palace, while I have given to the palace on your behalf 1,080 pounds of copper, and Umiabun has likewise given 1,080 pounds of copper, apart from what we both have had written on a sealed tablet to be kept in the temple of Samas. How have you treated? It's like, how have you treated me for that copper? You have withheld my money bag from me in enemy territory. It is now up to you to restore my money to me in full. Take cognizance that from now on, I will not accept here any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall from now on select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but if memory serves, that tablet that letter was on was found in a massive collection of similar complaints that this dude was screwing people over left and right and took pride in how many people he had pissed
He left
off
him on red.
every complaint.
So one of those things that I've always found very fun about that letter, and how at least how it's translated, is the phrase "one trifling mina of silver."
Yes.
So the thing, those things that that's not super well known is what the fuck is a mina?
Yes.
And a mina is a measurement of weight, and it's a measurement of unit in accounting in Mesopotamia, and it is equivalent to 60 shekels. And a shekel is defined as enough. It is 30 days worth of barley.
Yes.
Which is to say, it is basically a poverty wage. And so I did a quick calculation on what is a mina. So let's assume that a poverty wage is roughly equivalent to federal poverty level, right?
Yeah, something like that, I would say. I mean, it's difficult to do the analogy directly.
There's a million ways you could do this kind of thing, but I'm just trying to get a sense.
There's no CPI for 3000 BC.
Well, you know what's a good way is actually the barley itself, like what it was used for. So you could, with a mina, feed one dude like 2 times a day in a little bowl like this of wheat, like for what is it, 60 days or something like that?
No, a mina is 60 months.
Oh, 60 months, that's what it is. Yes.
Oh, it's like 5 years.
Yeah, so it's 5 years. Yeah. So a mina of silver,
it's not a small amount of money.
Well,
trifling to them, to Ea-Nasir maybe.
Yeah, Ea-Nasir, it's nothing.
My rough calculation using federal poverty guideline was about $64,000. So I've always found that kind of funny. Like it's not actually that trifling, and like to be the servant, put myself in the servant shoes of like carting around this stupid fucking tablet where this guy's complaining about, oh, just a trifling minna of silver. And like presumably these servants have to read it aloud, and the guy's just thinking, I get paid maybe a minna of silver. High skilled workers getting like a minna of silver like a year.
That's true. That's true. You're absolutely right. And I think that this is actually a really great intro to why people do the Babylonian madness, because part of what drives people,
I opt for the madness.
Yeah, no, right, no, but it's true, because like people who are interested in the origins of institutions like money, right, especially like, for example, socialists, many of whom are communists who want to abolish money, and even the ones who are not necessarily want to reduce the influence of money on our lives, right? So like what we would have to know what money is and what its origins are. Turns out it long predates capitalism, like by thousands of years. And the Bronze Age tablets that were only really rediscovered in the late 19th century. So we're talking about like a whole epoch of history that we were just like blind to for a very long time, that just emerged, and it has people talking like that guy in that letter. It drives people nuts because it blows up our notions of what the ancient world was like, and kind of forces us to radically reconfigure our sense of what is possible. And unlike almost all the societies of classical antiquity, the vast majority of records that we have from the Bronze Age, from Mesopotamia in this period, which is also the earliest agrarian society in like Eurasia, or well, it's tied with a couple other ones as the earliest. These are all administrative records. So we actually know in an extreme level of detail how they did their economic planning, which, by the way, they had economic planning. That's the other thing that's interesting about this, is that yeah, exactly. When you study what money actually is and what its deepest origins are, money was essentially an accounting system. There was no circulating money. Ordinary people would see silver maybe like once in their lives, like when they got married or something like that. At least that's what one of the anthropologists that we read said. Like they would and to make payments among each other, it wasn't a money economy, it was a gift economy, which was actually what the temple system emerged out of. But basically, and we can talk about the gift economy if we want in a bit, but I just want to do the temples because it's directly to Carl's point that he just made. Like the temples were not just places of worship. They were that, but they were also the first industrial parks and the first banks. And the system by which all that economic activity was coordinated was an accounting system that where like people would make payments to the temple once a year of a certain amount of grain or some other resource, like it could be chickens, it could be, I mean, it's actually some of the ones that they listed in that letter. And you had to pay the temple, like, because everybody basically, I mean, nobody quite knows exactly how the temples originated, but there's some circumstantial evidence that they seem at first to have been kind of like voluntary. Like these are important ritual sites for our culture and our shared cult. So we need to keep them going. Right, yeah. We need to keep them going so that we can keep doing the sacrifices to appease the gods for the next harvest. It seems like that might have been the way that they came about. But they would pay like an annual tax to the temple, and that tax was usually in grain. And it was measured by like a literal weight of grain, right? And the accounting unit, the shekel, corresponded directly to a certain amount of grain, specifically the amount of grain that you need to pay one dude for 30 days. So what that indicates to you is that the shekel, that was the shekel tax obligation that was imposed upon all the people in the Society of Farmers to give to the temple once a year, was basically in order for the temple to have the labor that it needed to perpetuate itself, to have the artisans who would make like their refined textiles, to have the priests who would do the sacrifices, and the priestesses who were very important ritually, and all this kind of thing. It was a planned economy to a great extent.
Some cases, extreme extent. Like in Egypt, they were planning their economy down to like what seed got planted where in like what field at what time of year. Like this was like ancient Egypt, the priesthood there would have made like the Soviet Gazplan administration blush with the level of detail that they went into. It's very interesting, like these highly centralized plan or quasi-centralized planned economies.
And, to talk about like the temple economy and how the shekel operated, I find it very fun because it's also how the two very separate Mesopotamian spheres of the foreign economy and the domestic economy finally merge.
Yeah.
Because the one of those things that there is an element of the economy that is seemingly very chaotic, which is international trade. And you know, when you're asking like, what are those temples making? What those temple artisans are making is they're mostly making export goods. Because Mesopotamia, one of the things that's very important to remember is that what the Sumerians actually could produce were basically grains, dirt, and refined grains. That's basically it. No stone, no metal, no wood. Terrible for animal products other than ones that can, other than like cows. So stuff like musk has to be imported from the north. Honey has to be imported from the Caucasus. Metal has to be imported from the Iranian plateau. Wood has to be imported from Levant. That's where we get Biblos from. The Bible, all those words all derive from that. And so that's they have to export a whole crap load, and really they just have grain, and you can use grain to make beer for export and ceramics for export, but also you need to pay people to make those things because those are all labor. You're all taking dirt and sunlight and using labor to transform it into goods that other people want. And that's the advantage of that temple system. And so the way that happens, and I find this very fun and fascinating, is that the nobility would take stuff out from the temple on credit, denominated in silver, and their job was to pay back the temple in silver. And this leads to a very, very good very cool bifurcation in the economy. And for the love of heaven, I really recommend that if you have the patience for it, read Michael Hudson's And Forgive Them Their Debts.
Yes.
That was how I went into Babylonian madness, was And Forgive Them Their Debts. And you know, he talks about how the Sumerians had a very regular practice, the amargi, the mother state, the debt jubilee, as it has been passed down through the Judaic tradition. And the thing about the debt jubilees that's really fascinating, where the king just says, I'm wiping out debt. The debt servicing in the economy has become a drag on the total economy. We need to end it. One of the things that's very fascinating about it is it did not apply to silver debt. If you were indebted to the temple for buying trade goods, that did not get obliterated. But if you were indebted to your landlord, or you were indebted to your local tavern, that got obliterated.
Yeah.
It's worth noting in this that like the silver economy is essentially like the foreign exchange economy. It's the trade, the international trade economy. So
International trade.
the internal economy's debts are erased, but the external ones are not. So it'd be kind of like on the equivalent if we did that in the United States of like all of our internal debt's going away, but the federal government's debt sticking around, that kind of thing.
To other governments.
Yeah. The U.S. sovereign debt would, you know, the bonds wouldn't go anywhere, that kind of thing.
Which is something that we kind of did at the end of the Articles of Confederation.
That's right. Yeah.
The early U.S. federal government assuming the state debts.
Yeah.
After the Revolutionary War.
Exactly,
but not repudiating its foreign debts to France or something like that.
Right.
Yep.
And
Soviet
just
Union
to
did too.
Sorry. What did you say?
Union did too. The Soviet Union did that too. They honored all of the Imperial Russia debts abroad.
Oh right, yeah.
Yeah.
And just to elaborate on what Kyle was talking about, so you have this like what you might call the domestic temple economy, and we're kind of giving the game away here by making these analogies because you know what happens is that the temple is not a state, but the state evolves out of the temple. But before that happens, when we still have like this kind of temple society, like they needed not just stuff that they could get domestically, like the grain, but stuff that they needed to build the temple, like tin and copper, especially. That was not where they were. It was way over there, where they had their own temples, incidentally, and stuff like that. So it's kind of like, okay, how do we get that? Well, we need to basically like go over and establish like diplomatic and trade relations and then trade for it. So what have you got? Well, we've got all the stuff that we produce in the temple, and that's why the temple had all these artisanal industries and stuff like that. They also have silver from silver mines or from previous trade. Silver, it turns out, was receivable between the temples. So what that means is that you could pay for especially like high-end goods using silver, or large bulk quantities of things like grain. So like a mina of silver being like, that the annual salary of somebody in barley, for example.
Just to make a quick clarification, just for anyone who kind of may have lost track of it, right? So like internally within the temple and its like local area, all the transactions are denominated essentially on like an internal ledger, more or less. It's like tracked by the internal accountants at the temple. It isn't like something that you're going to really be using money for most of the time. Whereas the external trade is, but another temple's not necessarily going to agree to your temple's internal ledger. It's like kind of like it's kind of like just like, yeah, trust me on that. We're not going to screw you. These records are totally believable, which other temples might not agree to. So.
Yeah, and as the guy complaining to Ea-Nasir said, he had some of his money, his silver was on deposit with the local authority, and he's not the only one who would be in that situation. The temple would have some of it has credit entries that represent all of its assets, but it only has some of it actually on deposit with them.
Yeah. So the way that I think about it is, for all intents and purposes, there is no circulating money within these like societies. Like everything runs on pure credit. And like, if it's just between us, it's like a gift economy thing, which is basically like, I do something for you or make something for you. You owe me one, and at the time of my choosing, like you have to repay me with something that is in the same category or more valuable. But this is all kind of loose and not precisely calculated. Then, in terms of people's relationship to the temple, they have a firm, very rigidly calculated obligation that is written down on the cuneiform tablets, but they pay using biophysical resources, usually, because ordinary people don't have access to silver. Silver is the most valuable thing that you use for like, very expensive international transactions. And the people who are doing those international transactions are basically government agents. The first merchants were what were a lot of anthropologists call them trade agents for the temple. The temple would basically loan them a bunch of the temple's like reserves of silver. They would say, in 1 year, you need to repay back this loan with interest. And you can't just pay in silver. You also have to pay in the shekel value of tin and copper and other biophysical resources that we need. But once you've paid that debt, you can do whatever you want with the silver. So you can, and this is how the first kind of merchant classes emerged that would like take the silver, go on a long, arduous journey to the other place, do whatever kinds of transactions they needed to do in order to get the tin and copper that the trade caravan would then bring back to the temple. They would pay in the silver and the tin and the copper and the other resources. They would keep whatever was left, including a bunch of silver and potentially a bunch of other resources that they could sell to other temples or to other merchants and so on. And so you get these like, very powerful oligarchs emerging who have their own control over biophysical resources and over purchasing power, because silver buys you goods and services in any of the temple systems. Even though all the temples have their own individual accounting systems, silver translates between them. But from the point of view of someone who's carrying around silver, a particular weight of silver will let them buy, at this rate in this place, at certain prices within their accounting system, goods and services that they could potentially want. So that's the other thing too. The silver that we're talking about is not coins; it's just weights of silver. That people. That's why in the old biblical stuff you see like the weights and measures, like this. That's because like they would put some standard weight on one end and the silver on the other, in order to see how much silver it was, and then that would, based on that, you would say, okay, this in our city, this is 80 shekels worth of purchasing power, and then that you could buy 80 shekels worth of whatever you wanted at the place. Although usually they would try to do it in like standardized ingot sizes, but it was like not regular at all. And the whole regional economy, like across the Eastern Mediterranean, basically, like, and well into the East as well, like, trade that reached as far as the Indus River Valley, was conducted using silver as an international means of payment. And this that translated into these domestic accounting systems that were the first monetary systems, that usually were just accounting systems on paper, where there were not like circulating currency within those places. And that's kind of like the initial Bronze Age system. And coins only developed later, after that system has its total apocalypse in what is it, 11 something BCE, 1170, I'm thinking. I might have the year wrong, but there's a year BCE, and we actually have the precise year. Weirdly, it's very unusual for this period.
Are you talking about the first coin?
Yes, but I'm talking about the Bronze Age collapse.
Oh, okay, leading up to the coin.
Yeah. So in 11, I forget what year.
So to just come up for air and maybe like pull out the important points so that people follow. What's important to note is, in these temple economies, there was no currency. There was like a debt ledger, and there was basically a centralized system of accounting. And then if these temples wanted to get resources that were scarce, or they didn't have enough of, or they didn't have any of in their region, they went to other temples and acquired them there with something that was universally valuable, i.e. weights of silver. And at that point in time, there was no such thing as currency. And this was the easiest way to do exchange between, or to acquire resources from other temple economies.
Thank you, Francis. That's much more coherent than we put it.
Someone in the comments said 1177.
Yes, I was about to remark on that. I Googled it too, but thank you, J-Talk. So, so essentially in 1177, this whole system collapsed. For reasons that are unclear. It seems to have been a mix of like supply chain issues due to climate change, and like the invasion or perhaps refugee crisis of some mysterious group called the Sea Peoples that to this day nobody knows who the hell they were. The whole system collapses within a 50-year period. Every single large scale population center in the Eastern Mediterranean is destroyed. And society, all the trade networks basically cease to exist, and there's like this massive disruption and reduction of complexity of the societies that produces like a mini Dark Ages that transitions into the Iron Age civilizations that we are likely to refer to as classical antiquity, as the kind of like origins of Western civilization or whatever. But in fact, they were kind of like the afterbirth of the collapse of a previous world system. That had to kind of reconstitute the pieces of what had been destroyed for whatever reason that we don't know. It was a really enormous collapse too. Like
that Dark Age is far worse than the Dark Ages we're familiar with. Like in Greece, it was like writing almost evaporated. Like written language almost did not exist in what became Greece from when the Mycenaeans collapsed. Also, the Egyptians were the only ones to really like survive.
Yeah.
Even then, it was a shadow of their former selves.
I mean, the New Kingdom survived. The Assyrians actually did okay.
The Assyrians were surprising.
Well, I mean, because they were nowhere near the epicenters of the collapse. It was really the Hittites and the Mycenaeans were completely obliterated. It was really the core of it. I'm sorry, I'm going to be really pedantic about this. I'm being very pedantic.
No, but it's good, and and it shows that there was continuity as well, which is important. Like, so I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which it was like a total apocalypse. But the thing is, compared to other like falls of empires, like it was really much larger scale, because it wasn't just one political collapse. It was like the regional collapse of what had previously been like a complete world system. And frankly, a lot of people think that the only real analogy for it historically is not any other historical event, but the potential future events of like climate change. Like it's really like our one analog for what we might be able to expect for the kind of scales of the disruptions that might happen due to climate change. So anyway, but things recovered in some places, and there was a kind of like almost all like actual knowledge. We actually know more about like Ugarit than Herodotus did, even though Herodotus was much closer in time, because knowledge of the specifics of all these old societies was basically like destroyed along with the societies. Nobody could read cuneiform in classical antiquity, or what we prefer to call the axial age. But nevertheless, like, a lot of the how-to knowledge did survive, including these accounting systems, by which you could reestablish these kinds of like centralized agrarian urban societies. But then there was an innovation in, I believe, I always get the year wrong, the 600s. What is it?
What are you
The
looking
Lydian
for? Lydian
coin.
coins? Oh,
Yeah.
600 to 625 BCE,
There you go.
somewhere between those two dates.
Okay.
Steve is the person who would know that off the top of his head.
Well, I looked it up after someone corrected me on another program.
Yeah. When we were doing the Varn interview,
Was
both
it
of us thought
Cohen?
it was yeah.
It was a coin made of, here, I'm gonna conclusively prove this knowledge. So it was a coin of electrum, which is like a
Oh.
mixture of gold and other alloys, other metals rather. And it was minted by the Lydian king Ea-Nasir. There we go.
Yeah. The importance of coins is that, like, we've been emphasizing, like, at length, that for thousands of years during the Bronze Age, there were no circulating domestic currencies. And what was used as the international means of payment was not a kind of standard unit, but like lumps of silver, and actually probably other forms of of standard kind of like receivable product as well. But the one that was dominant was silver.
But that was primarily between temple states, and
yes,
within economies, it was just a debt ledger.
That's exactly right. Yes. The reason why we've been emphasizing that so much is that it's only thousands of years later, like thousands of years after the invention of what you might call, like, accounting system money, right? It's only thousands of years later that we get money in the sense that you and I think about it, which is like, it circulates throughout the economy. I have it in my pocket. I use it to pay for goods and services in retail markets. Like, that only comes about after roughly 600 BCE, when the Lydian king issues the first coins. And here's the thing: it didn't come about through like this like nice little like voluntary exchanges. They didn't do like the barter, the kind of barter story of money. It came about as a tool of military conquest, because it turns out that when you're limited by how far you can extend your supply chain to feed an army, you're also limited in how far their army can conquer. Theoretically, on the other end, they can like pillage and stuff, but that's going to make people want to rebel. So all these little empires were like the size of like Texas. They weren't able to expand. But basically, like, coins, when you put coins of a standard weight of silver with the king's face on it in the soldiers' pockets, and they go over to the place that they just conquered and stay at like an inn, they can be like, you have to pay the king in his coin, and here's the coins. We need lodging. So people want the coins because that's how they can pay their obligations to their new overlord. So they'll receive that in payment. As icing on the cake, they're made out of weights of silver, which are already receivable on international markets. So, even if the king collapses, the monarchy collapses or whatever, you can melt it down into a brick of silver and it's still receivable places, so that you can buy stuff. And it's, but it sweetens the deal, and therefore allows empires to expand radically beyond their borders. And the old gift economies start getting replaced, because before, you and I were just like, when I wanted something at the inn, I would have a tab, that I would fill up, and then eventually I would have to repay it in my own goods and services for you. Now that the king has introduced these coins and we all have to pay taxes to the king, or else, that is like making it so that it's like, oh God, I need coins. So when I pay for my drink, it's not going to be on the tab system anymore. You're going to want it in coins because you need coins to pay the king, which means that I want coins, and I also want to pay the king too, and I want to get my drink. So and so on and so forth. So this is actually what creates retail markets. So military conquests spurred on the creation of coins as a technology of like better conquest, and that creates the first retail markets where people are buying and selling goods and services in a way that's familiar to us. Retail markets are the product of imperialist conquest, and this was all called the military coinage complex. that's the Mesopotamian essay that's coming out. It's going to be called Meet the Mesopotamians, probably, and it'll be coming out at some point soon.
I
Oh
I
God,
think
I
that's
need coins.
yeah.
Yeah.
God, I need coins.
Has this ever happened to you?
Yeah.
It's like, all
It's
right,
like
we
some
got
info-
circulating media now. I need
As
coins.
a person trying
2 a.m.
to their
infomercial. Have you ever needed to settle up your tab at the barkeep but just got conquered? Oh no,
Yeah.
what will I do now? You
I
need
do feel-
coins.
Yeah.
Sorry, Francis, you can go.
So I feel the need to be a little bit more like an MC here and like say, okay, so let's bring this back to the point. We've elaborated at length about Mesopotamian history and now like the development of the coin. How does this connect to bottom-up economics and contemporary economic theory? Fire away, JMC.
I thought if I can drop it.
Yeah, go.
Go for it. Go, Quinn.
I mean, I think one of the core lessons that I personally get out of that kind of thing, and that I get out of like most of these historical studies, is that money, or what we might analogize as money, better accounting essentially is probably a more effective term for that kind of thing, has taken a lot of forms over the course of history. It's been done in a lot of different ways, and Mesopotamia is one case study in it, and there are tons of them all over the place. I mean, China has some fascinating stories. I think there's always the Ming coinage is a particularly fun one, but it's something that's evolved and shifted and changed, and you see some of this like internal accounting stuff kind of show back up at other times in history. I mean, like feudal manors, like most of the people working in feudal manor lands, they didn't really use coins that much. That was usually like the local lord was using the coins, and so these kinds of things can reappear and can evolve and can have different contexts to them. And I think the real lesson from that is that the way that we do money now and the way that we think about it and utilize it isn't necessarily the way that it has to be or has to work, and that there are many, not only are there many forms that have been tried, there are probably plenty of them that we just haven't even conceived of yet, or that nobody's actually developed, or some of them might not work, others will. Some of them might be poor choices for some situations and great choices for others, but rather it's a really, really large and diverse toolbox that we have for managing accounts within an economy, for coordinating certain kinds of exchanges within any kind of productive system. And that as socialists, essentially our options are actually quite open, and that we're not necessarily shackled to money as it exists now, and that there are possibilities that we can take, lessons that we can learn in creating entirely new kinds of monetary systems, and that it's a lot more flexible and dynamic than we might be led to believe from our 21st century experience. That's my sorry, Finn.
No, it's really good. I would even add to that the other thing too is that which is very closely tied to the fact that these have changed from period to period, is that money is always, it's almost never about these like bloodless voluntary, oh, you have what I need and I have what you need, let's do a trade that's to our mutual benefit. Like that, to the extent that it happens at all, is like a secondary and kind of like deeply downstream kind of effect of money existing, and really only among people who have the kind of money that they can have those kinds of relationships. Maybe money is always about economic planning, hardcore geopolitics, and power. Like that is fundamentally the common thread among all these different systems that we can call by the name of money. And it's about the who has the power to allocate rich resources in what way, and how do we make decisions about how to allocate that power. That's basically what it's about. So and then for socialists who want to do bottom-up economics, one of the fundamental questions for us then becomes, okay, how do we want to make decisions about the allocation of resources, and who has the power to make those allocations? How do we democratize these systems If we choose to do away with them, like how could we retain their useful functions? You can't answer any of those questions unless you understand how the systems have actually worked, which is why you should look at stuff like the Mesopotamians.
Yeah. So we should probably wrap up in like half an hour or so, and we should have a section for questions at the end. So
Yeah.
I'm going to quickly like pull some pieces out from our Babylonian madness and coins to orient the reader to what the remaining what they should possibly expect from the remaining 3 pieces in our lineup. So the Mesopotamia, we refer to it as ziggurats. Meet the Mesopotamians. Will expand upon this history of accounting in Mesopotamia. History of Chartalism expands upon the history of the notion that currency is something that's created by the state and is, in some senses, an IOU. It's a way of conveying indebtedness. And is debt really limited by anything within a single economy? ? Expect elaboration on that idea. And then the last article is on forex. What happens when you consider money between states, where you have you are limited by the scarcity of the biophysical resources within a currency issuing state, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
So,
no, that's great. And I think that it's pretty clear that if we want to discuss any of these articles, because they're all so big and meaty, and do them justice, it requires like space and time to do it. Wow, that was really that was a little more cosmic than I was meaning. So I think that it's the sort of thing where we can do another stream that talks more in depth about the Chartalism article. And by the way, Chartalism's more famous name is Modern Monetary Theory, or MMT, or rather MMT is the latest instantiation of Chartalism. So it's kind of the attempt to be the definitive take on those debates that have been blowing up all over the place. So the MMT essay and the Forex essay can probably, we could probably do a whole stream just about those. And in fact, we've promoted the Forex article in both the Varn vlog, where we did, Steve and I did a stream on it. Steve and I kind of wrote a whole book on these subjects, actually, of which several of these are extracts. And then Steve and Carl did an excellent program, which is the one that I mentioned at the very beginning on the Robert Evans show. So you can watch those in anticipation of the articles, and History of Chartalism will be coming out this coming week. So you can check that one out.
I have a semi-closing question, which is, how does this all relate to bottom-up economics?
That's a great question. Do anyone want to?
I can volunteer an initial answer.
It looks like he's
which is that MMT has been sort of hotly discussed on the left as an opportunity for the public to demand that governments spend on social programs, that there ultimately is no limit to government spending within its own economy, that there is no limit to the amount of currency that they print. So there's a compelling reason to consider it, because maybe we can afford all the social programs we ultimately want. It requires that we examine everything that this theory is based on, and spend our due diligence on it. That's an initial answer to the question, but there may be several others.
I think it, to kind of build on that a little bit, it kind of follows on that, like, if you start viewing money this way, money is much more just a utility for managing these things that people are doing, these productive activities. The question of, like, could we, like, quote unquote, afford universal healthcare is kind of becomes a nonsensical question, because it's like, it's not about like having the money to do it. It's about, do you have the hospitals and the doctors and the clinics and the machinery and the medicine to do it? And it sort of transforms the question away from this, like, kind of this monetary space where, like, capitalist economists seem to have this weird monopoly and dominance on how things are thought about in this very specific dogma about how it should work, and changes the focus of the question a little bit, where the money that the state is spending is really just a system for facilitating the actual provisioning of healthcare. And then the question much more becomes, okay, well, like, how do you make sure that you structure the monetary system and the economy in such a way that that spending is fine and doesn't have any negative effects, which gets into a lot of the stuff around like inflation or, you know, XYZ thing, and making sure that you're not causing, you know, unexpected side effects from that kind of thing. Steve, you look ready to go on something.
In adding on to that, like in outside of the context of what a state could or should do, in light of these ideas, it also helps groups of socialists who are organizing themselves around like productive processes to have a clearer vision of how to develop themselves economically in sort of a quasi-state fashion, or like using ideas that would be important for any institution, whether it be a state or like a private entity or a worker cooperative or something. So I mean, you need to. It would be a good idea to have an eye for economizing on your foreign exchange reserves if you're some upstart, like revolutionary socialist project or something.
Doing dollars as your forex.
Yeah,
literally. And like if you
yeah.
had like understanding from Chartalism and forex pieces that we're going to release soon, the idea that you could have like you could start issuing your own domestic currency, but like peg it at a certain rate with the forex, and then like just judiciously manage those reserves such that you can import the goods that you can't make, like important things like capital goods, machines that could build other machines, so that you can sort of move up the power level of so to speak over the years, so that you won't need to import as much as you once did.
Sort of like an inevitability for any kind of dual power project is forex is just like this singularity that you have to go to at some point. If you're
It's like that knowledge helps you better realize your power, whether you're a state or a worker cooperative or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that this is the kind of thing where like concrete examples are the ones that like really inspire people's imaginations. And some of them you guys actually mentioned on the Robert Evans thing, so I'm just gonna throw out the ones that I remember. Like if you're trying to start a little commune, right? Like one of these like little agricultural communes or whatever, like you know, or collective housing of some sort, or something like that, and build it up as like its own institution. Like in the 19th century, the Fourierist communes and stuff kind of like failed to a great extent because like they were trying to be totally autonomous in a way that is unrealistic even for large nation states, much less for like a little agricultural commune. And it turns out that if you have to like grow your own food and make all your own stuff and do all this other thing, and it's like, you know, 5 to 50 people, it's just not going to happen for you. Like you're working all the time and creating subpar things that produce a low standard of living. The most successful communes all have export industries. They treat this economy that surrounds them as like that they're supposedly in the same country as like the foreign sector. And they have some kind of thing that they make. I mean, there's a little Anabaptist commune in upstate New York that their main export industry is that they have a manufacturing company that makes toys for hospitals that they sell to, like, you know, toys for children in hospitals. Hospitals are a very good customer base because they have a lot of money and they need toys. And they make enough money out of that to then, like, you know, be able to buy a lot of the things that the commune needs. But that manufacturing industry is a co-op. And many of the most a co-op owned by the entire community of people. So that goes to show you like a very concrete instantiation of these ideas. you know, and it can be like a union using the supply chain theory of inflation to argue against the bosses, saying that it's because of wage increases that they had to raise their prices for consumers. They could say, no, your price is administered and you're using it as an excuse, but let's look at the books and see what the actual costs are. And I bet you that a lot of it is going to be CEO pay or a bunch of other kinds of different things. And there's like, you know, and the revenues are fine compared to last year. So you're lying, right? They can do that if they have a correct theoretical analysis of the situation. So that's kind of like why these questions are so important, I would say.
They help build better praxis for dual power.
Yeah.
Also,
Better
it's funny, I was
knowledge,
thinking
better
about that.
praxis. Sorry?
I just had one thought about that Anabaptist commune you're talking about, which I also know several examples from around the world that do a very, very similar thing to that. But that one in particular, all I can think is like, this doesn't sound too different from these like Bronze Age temple systems, because like the you know, at that point the factory is just the temple, and like, you know, it's before like the silver is just replaced with dollars at that point. It's not so far off in a rough framework kind of way.
So we could transition into questions unless, Steve, do you want to talk?
Few last things I wanted to jump in on. For like the early to mid 19th century Fourierist communes and all of them, like among the ones that failed, like I was doing some reading on this, many of them had onerous debts to banks that were like the main financial reason why they failed. And so like they had debts to repay, and then they also had a balance of payment deficit going on sometimes. Balance of payment being they're the user of the dollar, they obviously don't issue it, and they need to have businesses going on so that they can import what they need from the outside world. Import, like becoming self-sufficient doesn't necessarily mean that you should like have autarky where you're just completely making everything you need as a goal.
Incredibly
So like
difficult.
in fact, part of the development arc for successful countries has been one that leans towards it doesn't mean like we don't want to import anything. It means there's things that we're just okay with importing, and in fact we kind of want to. It's cheaper for us overall.
It's kind of like, you know, if you're a small country, you don't necessarily want to be building your own semiconductor manufacturing industry, because that's extraordinarily difficult and expensive, and you can get it at like 1/1000th the cost from Taiwan or Korea.
Some of the Fourierists had religious reasons for why they chose not to import like hardly anything. So I mean, you know, there's not a lot you can do about it. You have to work around that basically. But other ones just they didn't have a good grasp of how they could develop their commune given the resources they have and also their debts to repay.
So Francis, you were.
Should I read off Jay's question? Jade Huck asks, what do you guys think about John Paget's, sorry if I'm butchering that pronunciation, economic analysis in Emergence of Organizations and Markets? Anyone's familiar?
So
I don't know if I'm familiar with that. I don't think I'm familiar with that.
I have not read it, but I was just looking at a kind of what seems to be like the initial essay version of it, or maybe it's a chapter of it. That's posted online for free, and I was just kind of like skimming it. It looks interesting. I mean, they're trying to do this like interdisciplinary science thing where they're trying to find out like common laws between like what causes like molecules to assemble and into life versus like what causes industries to congeal. The thing I like about it is that it's talking about some stuff that's kind of like up our alley in terms of like the like here, one of their little molecule maps is about these industries that emerge out of like clustered institutions that then kind of network out with commercial or financial or research and development relationships. This is like your geo-industrial clustering stuff, Steve.
Yeah, that's what came to mind, actually.
Yeah, this is, and they in fact call this the Boston, what do they call it? The Boston biotech. Yeah, the Boston local network or biotech cluster. So this is cool. I have no comment on it because I haven't read it. I was just kind of looking at it. But my general comment on something like this would be, the more that you're looking at concrete situations, the more likely you are not to be misguided. I do get a little sketched out by anyone trying to create like general laws for things, just because there's many ways that you can go about that in a kind of armchairy kind of way. But this looks really cool. So, but maybe a better way of answering the question would be, what are some books that we could kind of go around to that either we've been reading recently or that have really like influenced us in some way from like a bottom-up economics point of view? Maybe that would, book recommendations for folks.
I got one.
Okay.
You mentioned the concept already, geo-industrial clustering. There's a science article from 2020 or 2019, I think. Yeah, 2019. It published in Nature, actually. It's sort of an economics paper, but it's written by more like life sciences people. And it shows like even beyond specific supply chains or supply networks, even they're due to the unique geography and manner of education and the way that supply chains physically develops, people with specific skills will gather in specific areas to do specific tasks, basically. And it they form networks of labor markets where they didn't just go there because it was attractive because of taxes or something. It's much more complicated than that. And it has to do with a multitude of factors, but like you can kind of predict where development will occur in what ways, basically, by looking at the geo-industrial clustering that's going on.
Yeah.
And that seemed like very bottom up, like, because it was just taking as a given like the unique physical parameters of the world that you can't do anything about, but you can use it to your advantage and develop certain ways. And that has happened under capitalism, surely, but like if we tried to impose an abstraction over that, like an idealized society or something, it just wouldn't work. Not because we screwed up, but because like the world pushes back too egregiously, because we weren't going with the flow, so to speak, with where people are, what the world looks like in certain areas, and how you can move goods and services between different nodes along whatever supply chain you do end up building. I can link that paper later.
Any other book recommendations from a bottom-up economics point of view? Can touch on anything of the sorts that we've been talking about, I think.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull references from my recent forays in intellectual history. I was on a bout of reading a whole load of like colonial economic history, which I think is like really grounded in supply chains and domination. And I'm trying to I'm actually pulling up my syllabus right now to get some good references. But off the top of my head, Adom Getachew wrote an incredible book about the sort of reinstantiation of colonial power networks and of the supply of basic materials from the colonial world to the developed world in a series of power upsets in the 1900s. But I'll give you more precise examples if you just give me 3 minutes. But I'll hand it over to someone else like James, for example.
Yeah, no, that's great, and that stuff is so important too, because the people talk a lot about decolonization, but really decolonizing would mean seriously reading not just histories of the global south, but histories of the global south written by people from the global south, and kind of internalizing that perspective, which is definitely a major goal of the magazine. let me think. In terms of books that I would recommend that are in the econ category, bottom up economics for me means looking at stuff and seeing what has worked and what has not. And especially so with the point of view of trying to like ask the question, how could we run things from the bottom up and democratically? And there are, I would say, 3 books off the top of my head that have had a huge influence. 2 of them are kind of in the same cluster, and then the other one is kind of in a different cluster. So one of them is Post-Keynesian Price Theory by Frederick S. Lee, which is it basically has like the theory of prices and how they're set that are kind of like underlying Steve's supply chain theory of inflation, a lot of the analysis of microeconomic stuff that we talk about in the magazine. I'm going to write a profile of Lee in this issue or next, and it's a really powerful book to read because it lays out not just the theory, but the whole history of how the theory was discovered by all these different people who were looking at concrete situations and actually doing like surveys, for example, of business people to see how they set prices. And they came from very different backgrounds and political ideologies and stuff like that, but they were looking at the same thing. And they didn't know that each other existed, different time periods, whatever, but they were looking at the same thing, asking people and getting the same answers. So like it's a really good deep argument for why the theory is compelling and true, and it has exhaustive appendices talking about it. So that's a really great book, and it's pretty accessible. It's tough, but a layperson can read it without needing any special knowledge. So the other 2 books that have influenced me both come from developmental economics, and they're a huge influence. One is Kicking Away the Ladder by Ha-Joon Chang, and the other one is The Rise of the Rest by Alice D. Amsden. And both of these economists, Ha-Joon Chang and Alice D. Amsden, were developmental economists who broke with the rest of the developmental economist tradition because it's kind of like neoliberal prescriptions for how countries can become rich by actually looking at how actual countries that industrialized did so through case studies. And both books are chock full of case studies. They'll look at the way that India industrialized, or the way that China industrialized versus Taiwan, and they'll look at and they have all these different case studies of both early and late industrializers between the 2 books. And what they show is that a lot of the things that the already powerful countries are prescribing to the poorer countries that they should do not only don't work and fail to lead to real robust industrialization, but actually benefit the rich countries to do so, because it's preventing basically people from developing industries that can compete with the rich countries' industries. So it's a really powerful set of books, those 3, and I would highly recommend them for anybody who wants to learn bottom-up economics.
I don't have anything because my research doesn't really focus on reading books so much as it does just studying up various machining things. So I unfortunately don't have much in the way of helpful books in terms of conceptualization.
What about your favorite machining YouTube channel or something like that?
I don't know. There's never a singular channel that sticks out with it. There's a couple of good ones, I guess. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I would say from a book perspective, I think the last one that I wrote that might be categorized as bottom up economics as a case study, even if it is actually kind of a very sad book to read because the ending is known in advance, was John Michael, do you remember the name of that book? It was the one on the Spanish communes in the Civil War in the 30s.
Are you talking about the Gaston Laval book?
Yeah, Gaston Laval. I can't remember the name of the book, but look up the name of Gaston Laval. He wrote a book that was kind of I think it was the 1970s, doing interviews with people who had been, I think it was also based on his own reporting as well as interviews after the war of the Spanish, the communes in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and how they structured and sort of like how things went for them and the ways they went about things and some of the outcomes and such. And a lot of it's very agrarian focused. I think he has a very brief bit on like Barcelona, but most of it's like these small agrarian communes. And it is sad because, like, the ending of it is you'll get to the end of this chapter for like these people like, oh yeah, and then they like tripled the output of the land that they were on by like doing XYZ thing, and we're implementing these like really great agriculture practices, and then like and then like the fascists came in and they all got killed or something like that. It's very like painful to read in that sense, but it does offer up like concrete cases of like people basically like bucking capitalism and market systems and building radically different ways of creating goods and such. And they're all short-lived, but I would call it painfully inspiring, I guess. Like it is kind of inspiring that like, wow, these books, this and it worked and it went really well for them. And it's painful in the sense that it's kind of it's a vignette and a tragedy. So, but if you haven't read that book, I highly recommend giving it a read. It's quite, I don't know, eye-opening isn't quite the right word for it, but it broadens the imagination a bit, I guess I'd say. Expands the horizons of what you might think could be possible. That's the only like book recommendation I would have.
I actually have one meta recommendation, because it's one that you recommended to me, that the YouTube channel where the guy recreates the Antikythera mechanism.
Oh yeah, that guy. I remember the channel.
Is so cool.
I thought you were going to recommend the one with the hydraulic press.
I love the hydraulic press one too. Those are both great channels.
Welcome to Hydraulic Press
channel. So one of them is a YouTube channel where there's a hydraulic press, and each episode they crush a new thing in the hydraulic press. Which is extremely satisfying, but also slightly disturbing. They'll crush a Furby,
Well, that channel started when he tried to fold paper 7 times, and on the 7th fold, it exploded. Reaction to that scorched into my cortex, just that thick Finnish accent. What the fuck? And walking around in the paper turned chalk material.
But
I'd have to follow up like a list of YouTube channels that cover that kind of thing. It's not the most engaging watching, because it's like there aren't really channels that focus in on like, oh, how does like the manufacturing of things actually work, but there are like, you can find things that are like fragments of it or like examples of things. It's very slim pickings. But
there's a tangential one that I'll interject with I'll interject JMC interjecting. Anyway, there was this great series done by Bon Appetit called Gourmet Makes, where a gourmet chef tried to make a mass-produced, like a factory-produced food item, but in her gourmet kitchen. And it was like the most involved process for her, because you simply can't achieve the kind of bizarro consistencies and temperatures and like flow rates that you can in like industrial machinery in a kitchen.
It's really funny.
And so there's a section in each video where she like looks at these YouTube videos of like Fruit Loops flowing down a conveyor belt or like through the various elements of their production process, and like studies it, and it's like, okay.
I do have actually, you made me think of one, for instance. I do actually have a very good channel. Don't know, ask me why that reminded me of this particular channel. There's one by this, I think he's Taiwanese. This guy, I don't even know his name, but the channel's called Asianometry. And he is this, he focuses primarily on like the semiconductor industry. But he does dig into other ones too. Like he did one, I think it was like India and pharmaceuticals very recently. But he dives into like how certain industries will work and how certain production processes will work. And he'll go very far into like the dynamics of it and like the histories of it, and like how did like, Taiwan and South Korea become dominant in semiconductor manufacturing? Like how did that story play out? And like, why did like, Europe's semiconductor industries fail? Why did the Indian attempt fail? Why did the Singaporean attempt fail? Why did the Japanese fall so far behind? And he'll dig very far into the dynamics of that. I don't know how much that qualifies as like bottom up necessarily, but it is very informative, I think, to getting a sense of the complexity and the dynamics at play in manufacturing goods, and it's at like the most extreme end of that spectrum, because like you're talking about like semiconductor manufacturing, which is about as intense as any industrial process can get. And so it can be like an expose on like the most extreme case of manufacturing and what can go into things, but also how like deceptively simple it can be at other times too. So might recommend that channel, Asianometry, if you want to spend 15 minutes learning about, making microchips.
So Kyler Francis, which one of you wants to go?
I've already done mine. I mean, mine was kind of an amalgam of like economic history and colonial economic history. And the book that I mentioned, which may not be perfectly on topic, was Adom Getachew, World Making After Empire.
Got it. That's awesome. I actually want to read that one, so I'm gonna actually get myself a copy. And Kyle, any book recs for bottom up economics?
Shockingly obvious recommendation, Collective Courage by Jessica Gordon Nembard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Shockingly obvious recommendation for us. Read that fairly recently, recently as in like a year ago. And it's it's the story, it's a historical story by an American economist about particularly Black-owned co-ops and how African-American communities used cooperatives, not just productive cooperatives like we are, but also consumer cooperatives, which sometimes people poo-poo consumer cooperatives because, oh, it's just consumption. But the fact of the matter is that you need food to eat. And a lot of the oppression of African-Americans in the Jim Crow era was on consumptive grounds, was by restricting people's access to goods, by jacking up prices and restricting what quality of goods that were accessible to African Americans. And Black-owned co-ops were a way of circumventing this. And she goes, a lot of, I would call them medium-scale victories. Obviously, racism in America has not been truly defeated. So, the idea that this is like a true revolutionary, complete solution is not something that she is advancing throughout her narrative. But it does provide some very meaningful context for ways in which you can take a reading group and turn it into a truly radical improvement in your community. And the other is actually kind of along similar lines, another very practical manual, Organizing Methods in the Steel Industry by William Foster. It's from 1936.
That's a really old school, yeah.
It's old school. It's been making the rounds right now. It's kind of going viral because the Amazon labor union in Staten Island says that this was their manual.
Yeah.
For their victory that they just won. This was the manual they went to. It's quite short. Took me like 20 minutes to read. But I think was incredibly practical, and I thought it was very good for. I've done some left-wing organizing in my time, and it was a lot of things that I found frustrating in the left-wing organizing I saw were called out in this as straight-up mistakes. These moments where I'd have these frustrating moments of like, am I just not experienced enough to understand why we're doing this tactic? And this book just says, no, that's just a flat out mistake that your organization was making. So those two I can recommend. Very practical manuals, very practical histories. But a lot of, obviously, if I'm on this co-op project, part of my belief is, unsurprisingly, that we can do the changes today. We can start fighting for economic control today. We can start doing it. We can start taking collective action without already agitating 100% of the people. You don't have to agitate 100% of the people to start taking contrary action. And in fact, that's a stupid strategy. That's an asinine strategy, because how are you going to get people on your side if you don't have victories to point to?
Yeah, absolutely.
You shouldn't wait for anybody's permission to start.
Yeah. Don't wait for people's permission. Don't delay justice for yourself. Don't expect, and in general, just don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Like, fight for yourself and fight for your community, and you can do that collectively, and you don't need to be bigger than Fox News to get started.
Honestly, I could not think of a better note to end on than that.
Yeah.
I think that that's exactly the inspiring message that we'd want to leave people with. So shall we call it?
I think so.
We answered one question in our Q&A. It took us 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And we didn't even answer the question. We transformed it into a different
You're
one.
ruining the
I'm sorry.
But,
Give it to us on Twitter. We can get to it on Twitter.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And I think we should all link some of our reading in the Twitter thread that I've been documenting this conversation in.
Yes, we should do that. We can probably just I'm just gonna copy and paste some of this into the chat here so that we can
But
do
we can do that after we call.
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
And just last note of business for folks: if you've liked this presentation and you really want to help us out, we are still doing our fundraiser, and we're doing it to raise $25,000 so that we can pay our writers above market rate, because we think market rate is too low. None of the money of the initial fundraiser is going to us. All of it is going to the writers who've already produced incredible content for us and been waiting very patiently. So and overhead business costs to keep the shop going. So if you believe in some of the stuff that we've been talking about, or you found it inspiring, and you have any ability to give, we really would encourage you to go to tinyurl.com/strange matters and donate whatever you're able. And if you can't, that's totally okay. But if you could spread the word, we would greatly appreciate it. Because we think that the stuff that we and our writers are doing is potentially really important and can help a lot of people in the movement, and we want to be able to keep doing it because this is how we can make a difference and fight back.
And also, our existence is good in the media ecosystem. It's good to have cooperatively owned media, and it's good for this model to be out there and for other people to see us doing this stuff. Yep.
Okay, so thank you for joining us, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Cheerio.